Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting with the Babes in the Woods murders in Brighton, 1986. The seaside city of Brighton has always had a certain charm. Narrow streets filled with small shops, the scent of the channel drifting inland, and a constant hum of activity. But even places known for their brightness carry their own shadows. And in the autumn of 1986, a discovery in a quiet patch of woodland drew the city into one of the most unsettling child murder cases in modern British history. It began on a cool morning in October. The leaves in Wild Park had already turned to golden brown, carpeting the ground in thick layers. Dog walkers moved along the usual routes, their footsteps muffled by the earth. Everything seemed ordinary until one walker took a path a bit deeper into the trees, a small detour that changed everything. There, beneath a makeshift arrangement of branches, lay the bodies of two little girls. The sight was so unnatural in the gentle stillness of the woods that at first, the walker didn't understand what he was looking at. He froze, trying to process the shapes in front of him. Two children, close together, almost as if asleep. But the stillness, the silence, the unnatural positioning, it told the truth long before the police arrived. Authorities quickly identified the victims as 9-year-old Nicola Fellows and her friend, Karen Hadaway, both reported missing the previous evening. The two had been last seen playing near their homes in the Molescombe estate, a working-class neighborhood north of Brighton. They were supposed to return home before dark. They never did. As the news spread, residents locked their doors, pulled their children inside, and whispered in disbelief. Two girls, taken and killed in a place they walked past nearly every day. Something that simply wasn't supposed to happen here had become horrifyingly real. Police launched an immediate investigation, sweeping the wooded area, interviewing neighbors, and retracing the girls' final steps. Soon, attention turned to a local man, a 20-something named Russell Bishop, known to some in the area, but not especially well-liked. There were whispers about him, vague concerns, moments where his behavior had unsettled others, but nothing concrete enough to make him more than a name on a list. But circumstances had pushed him to the center. Bishop had been one of the volunteers who helped in the search for the missing girls the night before their bodies were found. Detectives often look closely at anyone who inserts themselves into an investigation, especially when their involvement seems oddly enthusiastic. And Bishop's statements, where he claimed he had seen the girls earlier that day, were inconsistent, shifting slightly each time he repeated them. Then came the physical evidence. Fibers, traces of the girls' clothing, and marks on Bishop's clothing that didn't match his explanation for where he'd been. The case seemed strong, at least on paper, for the families who were trapped in a new, unfamiliar world of grief. The possibility of a quick arrest offered a small sense of direction. But trials are unpredictable. In 1987, Bishop was charged with the murders, and Brighton waited for answers, hoping for closure. Yet inside the courtroom, the case began to crumble. Key forensic techniques were still developing, and defense attorneys seized on every weakness. Witness testimony wasn't as firm as investigators had hoped. The fibers on Bishop's clothing were argued to be transferable from innocent contact. And one crucial piece of evidence, a sweatshirt believed to be tied to the killer, was challenged relentlessly, its origin and handling brought into doubt. In the end, Russell Bishop was acquitted. The verdict sent ripples through Brighton. Many residents were furious. Others were afraid. And the families of Nicola and Karen were left with a hollow kind of despair. The kind that comes when a door you were sure would lead to justice swings shut instead. The case went cold. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but drifting, waiting, suspended. Years passed. The families aged. The investigation files gathered dust, then were reopened, then shelved again. Technology improved, but without new evidence, detectives could only hope that one day something would break loose. That moment came from a place no one expected. In 1990, just a few years after Bishop's acquittal, he was arrested again, this time for a brutal attack on a young girl who survived the ordeal. The details were chillingly similar. abduction, assault, and attempt to hide evidence. He was convicted and sentenced to life. The families of Nicola and Karen watched from a distance, knowing what the police believed, but what the courtroom had never been able to prove. Bishop was locked away, but the murder case remained legally untouched. Still, time has its own way of revealing truth. By the early 2000s, forensic science had reached a level investigators could only dream of in the 1980s. DNA analysis was more precise, contamination could be ruled out more effectively, and old samples stored from the original investigation were suddenly useful again. Detectives revisited the evidence, especially that controversial sweatshirt. This time, the testing was conclusive. Fibers from the girls' clothing were found embedded in the fabric. DNA traces tied directly to Nicola were present, and new techniques showed that the sweatshirt had indeed been worn by the killer around the time of the murders. The sweatshirt that had once divided a jury had become a decisive piece of physical truth. But there was one complication. Bishop had already been acquitted. For decades, that would have meant he could never be tried again. Then the law changed. In 2003, the UK abolished the absolute protection of double jeopardy in cases where new and compelling evidence emerged. It opened a rare path, narrow, strict, but real, for a retrial. The families of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hathaway gathered their strength. After more than 30 years, after grief, frustration, and time itself pushing forward, they were told that the case could finally return to court. And this time, the science was on their side. In 2018, 32 years after the girls were buried, the trial began. The courtroom was quiet, somber, heavy with decades of waiting. Witnesses revisited nights they wished they could forget. Forensic experts explained how technology had caught up with the evidence. The sweatshirt, once disputed, now stood as the anchor of the case. Fiber evidence, DNA results, and Bishop's history all aligned in a way that left little room for doubt. This time, the jury didn't hesitate. Russell Bishop was found guilty of the murders of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hathaway. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring he would never leave prison again. For the families, the verdict didn't bring back the girls. Nothing could, but it did close something. That open wound left in 1987 finally sealed, though the scar would always remain. Brighton changed in small ways after the murders. Wild Park, once a place families wandered freely, became a site of quiet remembrance. Locals passed it with a different awareness, a gravity that settled into the landscape. Trees grow, seasons turn, but certain memories never fade from a place's identity. When people speak of the babes in the wood case today, it isn't the forensic triumph they remember first. It's the image of two little girls, side by side in a quiet patch of woodland, and the promise, silent, steady, that no matter how long truth takes to surface, it is still capable of rising. Next up, Luísa de Jesus, the monster of Abrantes. The streets of Abrantes, a quiet town in central Portugal, seemed ordinary at first glance. Narrow cobblestone lanes wound between modest homes, and the rhythms of daily life carried on with the measured pace of rural towns in the 18th century. Yet behind the facades of simple houses, horror was quietly taking place. Among the villagers, whispers circulated of babies disappearing, of mothers grieving in silence, of a woman whose name would soon become synonymous with terror, Luísa de Jesus. Born in 1753, Luísa's life began unremarkably. She was a servant, married, and known as a quiet woman, blending into the daily routines of her community. But behind her unassuming exterior, she harbored a secret that would shock all who would eventually learn it. She became what historians today call a baby farmer, a woman who took in infants for a fee, ostensibly to care for them while their parents worked or sought assistance. In 18th century Portugal, infant mortality was high, and many parents were desperate, willing to entrust their children to someone who promised safety and sustenance. Luísa's operation began in modest fashion. She took children in exchange for money, claiming she would provide proper care. But what happened behind the closed doors of her home was far from care. Over the years, It is estimated that Luisa de Hijas murdered between 30 and 40 infants, suffocating them, strangling them, or abandoning them to die. Some were left in small cupboards or chests. Others were hidden in corners, their cries silenced before they could be heard. Families, trusting and desperate, believed their children were safe, unaware that Luisa had no intention of nurturing them. The horror of her crimes only came to light through a combination of suspicion and chance. Villagers began to notice a disturbing pattern. Mothers who had entrusted children to Luisa never saw them again. Complaints were initially dismissed or ignored. Infant mortality was tragically common, and rumors alone carried little weight. But as more families spoke out, authorities could no longer ignore the evidence. Luisa was arrested, and the investigation began in earnest. During questioning, Luisa initially denied wrongdoing. She claimed the children had died of natural causes or had been returned to their parents. But as investigators pressed, inconsistencies emerged. Neighbors testified about the children she had taken in, the promises she had made, and the strange odors and noises that sometimes came from her house. Items belonging to missing children were found hidden in cupboards, along with disturbing evidence suggesting deliberate concealment. The trial of Luisa de Hijas was a sensation. Hundreds of villagers crowded into the courtroom to witness the proceedings. Witnesses gave testimony after testimony, recounting details of children entrusted to Luisa and never seen again. Medical experts, to the extent they existed in that era, examined remains and corroborated the timeline of deaths. The court was confronted with an unthinkable reality. A woman, entrusted with the care of infants, had systematically murdered them for profit. Accounts from the trial reveal the meticulous way Luisa carried out her crimes. She reportedly preferred infants because they were small, vulnerable, and unlikely to resist. She used her knowledge of domestic spaces, cupboards, chests, and other hidden corners to conceal bodies. Some victims were killed immediately. Others suffered longer before their deaths. Her motives, historians suggest, were primarily financial, but the sheer scale of the murders indicates a cold, calculating disposition. Throughout the investigation, Luisa displayed a disturbing calm. She spoke plainly of her actions when confronted with irrefutable evidence, admitting to some murders while deflecting others. Her confessions, extracted without torture, revealed both the method and scale of her crimes. The shock was profound, not only because of the number of victims, but also because the perpetrator was a woman, a figure who in contemporary society was often associated with care and protection, not cruelty. The verdict was inevitable. Luisa de Hijas was convicted of multiple counts of murder. In 1793, she was executed, bringing an end to her reign of terror, but leaving a community scarred and grieving. Her crimes shocked Portugal, drawing attention to the vulnerabilities of children and the dark side of human greed and deception. Chroniclers of the time ensured that her story would be remembered, detailing her methods, her confessions, and the suffering of her victims. Even though so much time has passed already, Luisa de Hijas stands out in history for the audacity and cruelty of her crimes. In a time when the death of a child was tragically common, she exploited societal trust to commit acts that went far beyond neglect or misfortune. Her story is a chilling reminder that danger can hide in the most ordinary places, behind the face of someone who seems unremarkable, even trustworthy. The town of Immerse slowly returned to routine after her execution, but the memory lingered. Families who had lost children to her care struggled with grief that would never fully heal. Villagers told stories of strange noises in empty houses, of shadows flitting across windows at night, sometimes attributing them to the restless spirits of those who had suffered at Luisa's hands. Her name became a caution whispered among parents, a way to warn children about the hidden dangers that might lurk behind a kind face. Luisa de Hijas' crimes were extreme, systematic, and horrifying. The detailed accounts preserved in court records and contemporary chronicles provide one of the clearest examples in 18th century Europe of what modern criminology would classify as serial killing. Unlike many of her contemporaries, her actions were deliberate, repetitive, and targeted a vulnerable population for personal gain. Her story shocks because it involves innocence betrayed in the most intimate way. A caretaker turned executioner, a figure entrusted with life who instead delivered death. Next story, the Moors murders. This story takes us back to northern England in the 1960s, to a landscape of quiet neighborhoods, factory shifts, corner shops, and a long stretch of the Saddleworth Moor. It's a case that unsettled the region for generations, not because of a single event, but because of a series of disappearances that seemed, at first, unrelated. Children vanished while simply walking home, heading to a friend's house, or stopping by a nearby shop. The city of Manchester was growing quickly at the time, its streets crowded with workers and families moving through predictable routines. Yet somewhere within that everyday rhythm moved a pair who watched those patterns with cold calculation. Their actions, spread over years, would haunt the moorlands and the families connected to them for decades. This is the story of the Moors murders, a case where ordinary streets crossed paths with unimaginable darkness, and where searches through windswept hillsides continued long after the criminals were caught. The early 1960s in Manchester felt steady, structured, almost predictable. Most families lived close to where they worked, and children spent their evenings playing outside or visiting friends without much fear. That sense of freedom was part of the neighborhood atmosphere. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least recognized faces enough to feel comfortable. 12-year-old John Kilbride was one of those kids. He was responsible, well-liked, and usually home before dusk. On the evening of November 23rd, 1963, he went to market to help return empty bottles, hoping to earn a bit of pocket money. It was the kind of small errand countless children did every day. But John didn't come home. His parents searched the immediate area first, then contacted police, hoping he was delayed or with friends. But as hours became days, the situation grew heavier. Posters went up. Volunteers walked long distances, checking roadsides, fields, and canals. Yet nothing surfaced. No sighting, no clues, just a growing, uncertain silence. 8 months later, another child disappeared, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, who vanished while walking to his grandmother's house on June 16, 1964. His route was familiar, only a short walk along local roads. He never arrived. Manchester's families felt a shift. 2 boys missing within a year. No witnesses. No answers. The disappearances continued. Leslie and Downey, 10 years old, was last seen at a fairground on the day after Christmas, 1964. The festive lights, the noise, the crowds, it all hid the moment when she was taken. Her absence was noticed quickly, her mother calling police in a panic. But again, the trail went cold almost immediately. Investigators began to wonder if these cases were connected. They didn't want to frighten the public without evidence. Yet the similarities were impossible to ignore. Young victims, quiet vanishings, no ransom demands, no traces left behind. Something calculated was happening. And in the shadows of all this, moving unnoticed, were Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. To neighbors, they looked like an ordinary couple. Brady had a serious demeanor, always reading thick books and keeping to himself. Hindley was polite, steady at her clerical job, known for taking care of her younger sister. Nothing about them suggested danger. If anything, they blended perfectly into the background. But behind closed doors, the two crafted a hidden world built on manipulation, control, and fascination with violence. Brady spent nights reading about criminal psychology and extreme ideologies, while Hindley orbited him with absolute loyalty, her moral compass bent toward whatever pleased him. Together, they pushed further into darker fantasies that seeped into the real world. Their method was disturbingly simple. Hindley, who seemed trustworthy, would approach a child alone and offer a lift or ask for help with something small. Directions, carrying an item, a quick errand. Brady waited in the car. Once the victim was inside, the pair drove toward the high, quiet stretches of Saddleworth Moor. an area of rolling hills and open skies that hid everything beneath its surface. There, the children vanished forever. For a long time, the murders continued with no sign pointing toward the pair. Police had theories, suspicions, and lists of persons of interest, but nothing substantial enough to bring them closer. And as months passed between disappearances, it seemed each case stood on its own, even though the same unease tied them together. Everything changed on October 7th, 1965. That evening, Myra Hindley's teenage sister had a violent argument with her boyfriend, David Smith. In the heat of it, Brady intervened and invited Smith over, apparently trying to calm the situation. Smith agreed, hoping to keep the peace. But what he witnessed that night inside the couple's home would finally unravel everything. Smith saw Brady commit another murder. This time, a teenager named Edward Evans, lured to the house instead of the Moors. The act was swift, shocking, and far beyond anything Smith could have imagined. Hindley assisted quietly, as though she had done it all before. The casualness of it horrified him. Smith didn't run immediately. He pretended to stay calm, helping them clean up, but inside he was terrified. When he left the house later that night, he walked straight to a nearby phone box with shaking hands and called police. That single call broke open the case that had haunted Manchester for years. Officers arrived at Brady and Hindley's home within hours. They found bloodstains that hadn't been cleaned properly. They found inconsistencies in their statements. And then they found something even more disturbing. A collection of photos and audio recordings kept hidden away. The photographs showed the victims posed on the moors. The recordings captured Leslie and Downey in her final hours. The evidence was overwhelming. Police expanded their search to Saddleworth Moor. The land was vast, cold, and irregular, the kind of terrain that could hide anything beneath its surface. Officers, volunteers, and excavation teams spread across miles of peat and grass. After days of searching, they found 2 graves, shallow, marked only by the natural shape of the land. One held John Kilbride, the other held Leslie, and the moors became a place tied forever to the children whose lives were taken there. Even the wind seemed different as searches continued, as if the landscape itself carried a memory of what had happened. Brady and Hindley were charged, tried, and convicted. Their names became synonymous with cruelty rarely spoken about in public at the time. The families, who had lived through years of uncertainty, finally had answers, though none were easy to bear. But not every child was found. Keith Bennett, the boy on his way to his grandmother's, remained missing. For decades, his mother wrote letters, attended hearings, pleaded for information, and even visited the moor herself, walking the hills in hope of finding something, anything. Brady claimed he remembered the location, but never revealed it clearly enough to allow recovery. Hindley said she didn't know. The truth stayed locked inside the pair long after their convictions. The moors were searched repeatedly over the years. Teams returned whenever new tips or advances in technology offered the faintest possibility of locating Keith. But the landscape changed with the seasons, grass growing, peat shifting, erosion reshaping the ground. A final answer never came. Brady and Hindley remained in prison for the rest of their lives. They aged behind walls, while the families aged on the outside, carrying memories of children who never grew older than the day they disappeared. Even now, the moors hold an unmistakable quietness. People who hike there describe a sense of something just out of reach, not a supernatural presence, but a weight tied to the land's history. A place that once saw ordinary childhood mischief now carried the echoes of stories that will never fully fade. Next story, Jack Sheppard, London, 18th century. Jack Sheppard was not born into fame or fortune. He came into the world in 1702 in the cramped, bustling streets of London's East End. Life was hard for the working class. Families shared tiny rooms, the air thick with smoke and soot from the city's chimneys, and the streets were crowded with pickpockets, street vendors, and beggars. Jack's father was a carpenter. His mother worked tirelessly to keep the household afloat, and Jack himself grew up learning the harsh lessons of survival in a city that offered little mercy. From a young age, Jack showed a peculiar talent. He could escape trouble faster than anyone else. He had a natural agility, a nimbleness that made him difficult to catch. It started small, perhaps slipping away from a beating at school or a reprimand at home. But soon, this skill would define his life. He turned to petty theft, stealing small items from markets or neighbors, and quickly learned to disappear before anyone could stop him. By his teens, Jack had earned a reputation in the underworld of London. Thieves and burglars whispered about him with a mixture of admiration and fear. He became known not only for the crimes he committed, but for his uncanny ability to escape from authorities, a man who could vanish from locked rooms, barred windows, and tightly guarded streets. Jack's criminal career escalated. He broke into wealthy homes, stole silver and gold, and occasionally aided in larger robberies. Unlike other criminals of the time, he didn't rely solely on intimidation or force. Jack studied locks, observed guards, and used clever disguises. He moved through the city like a shadow, slipping past the watchful eyes of law enforcement. But it was not just his thefts that made him notorious. It was his prison escapes. Time and again, Jack found himself captured, bound in irons, or confined in secure cells, only to break free within hours or days. One story tells of him climbing out of Newgate prison using bedsheets as ropes. Another recounts him slipping through narrow gaps in cell walls, despite guards' constant vigilance. Each escape was more daring than the last, and each added to his growing legend. People began to speak of him as more than a thief, as a symbol of defiance, a man who could outwit the law with skill and audacity. His fame spread beyond London. Pamphlets and broadsides circulated stories of Jack Shepherd, exaggerating his exploits, celebrating his cunning, and sometimes painting him as a folk hero. In a city struggling with poverty and corruption, Jack became a figure people could root for, even if his crimes were real. His escapes fascinated the public. The authorities were humiliated each time he vanished from their grasp. But notoriety comes with a cost. Jack's actions drew attention from powerful enemies. Jonathan Wild, the infamous thief-taker general, saw Jack as both a threat and an opportunity. Wild ran an extensive criminal network in London, presenting himself as a law enforcer while secretly profiting from the thieves and fences he controlled. Jack, independent and untouchable, did not fit into Wild's plans. A conflict was inevitable. In 1724, Jack's luck ran out. After months of pursuit, he was captured in a daring trap orchestrated with the help of Wild and the city authorities. This time, escape would not come easily. Jack was taken to Newgate Prison, a grim, fortified structure designed to hold the most dangerous criminals. He was shackled, cells reinforced, and guards stationed to ensure no repeat of previous escapes. Even so, Jack attempted one last escape. The city watched with bated breath as rumors spread of his movements, of whispered plans, of the man who had defied the impossible. But this time the law prevailed. Jack was tried and found guilty of robbery and burglary, with the court emphasizing his repeated offenses and the danger he posed to society. On November 16, 1724, Jack Shepherd was executed. A crowd gathered, thousands strong, eager to witness the end of a man who had become a living legend. Spectators cheered, wept, and whispered stories of his past escapes. Even in death, his name carried the thrill of rebellion, the daring of a man who had danced on the edge of law and chaos for years. Jack Shepherd's story did not end with his hanging. Writers, pamphleteers, and dramatists immortalized him in plays, pamphlets, and novels. Each retelling added new layers of daring, new escapes, and new confrontations with authority. The line between fact and legend blurred. To the ordinary Londoner, he became a figure larger than life, a thief whose cunning and courage seemed to challenge the very order of the city. The city's streets, the prisons he escaped from, and the taverns he frequented all became part of his narrative. People told his story in hushed tones late at night, embellishing the details, imagining how he had slipped through iron bars, vaulted over walls and vanished into darkness. Jack Shepherd had become both man and myth. His life a thrilling chronicle of crime, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. In the years after his death, authorities tightened prison security and reformed methods to prevent escapes like Jack's. Yet stories of his exploits continued to circulate, inspiring future generations fascinated by the audacity and cunning of a man who had defied the law so spectacularly. Jack Shepherd was more than a thief. He was a master of movement, timing, and human psychology. He understood how fear, greed, and curiosity could be manipulated to his advantage. Each burglary, each escape was meticulously planned, executed with precision, and survived by the sheer force of his wit and agility. For the people of London, he became a legend, a man who turned the city's shadows into his playground, who made the impossible seem routine, and who left an indelible mark on the criminal history of 18th century England. Next story, the disappearance of Richie Edwards, UK, 1995. The winter of 1995 settled heavily over London. Cold air drifted through the narrow streets around the Embassy Hotel in Bayswater, carrying the familiar hum of traffic, the distant hiss of buses, and the muffled rhythm of late-night footsteps. Inside the quiet rooms of the hotel, a man named Richie Edwards, lyricist, guitarist, and one of the public faces of the Manic Street Preachers, moved through the final hours before his disappearance with a calm that would later feel unsettling. In those days before February 1st, Richie lived a life split between public performance and private turmoil. He was known for his sharp intelligence, his introspective writing, and a stage persona shaped by intensity rather than theatrics. Fans admired him. Journalists tried to understand him. Friends worried about him. Behind every interview and every photograph, there lingered a sense that Richie was fighting something internal, something heavy, something old. He and bandmate James Dean Bradfield were scheduled to fly to the United States for promotional work. The plan was simple. Check out the hotel, head to Heathrow, begin another round of interviews and appearances. Nothing about that morning suggested the start of a mystery or the end of Richie's known movements. At dawn on February 1st, the sky remained pale and colorless, the kind of morning without definition. Richie left his room quietly, carrying a bag, dressed plainly. Hotel staff later recalled nothing unusual. He walked with the same slight hunch, the same steady gait. He met James in the lobby, and the two drove toward the airport. The conversation was brief, mostly procedural, the kind of exchange two men might share when travel has become routine. When they reached Heathrow, James assumed Richie would follow him inside. Instead, Richie lingered near the entrance. When James turned around, he was no longer there. No one knew then that this would be the final confirmed moment anyone would see him. Hours later, Richie's car, a silver Vauxhall Cavalier, was located at his flat in Cardiff. He had apparently driven the long stretch of highway from London to Wales in silence, passing fields, towns, and the wide, open landscapes that lay between the two cities. Security cameras and toll records later helped map his route. He crossed the Severn Bridge at 2:55 p.m., paying the toll manually. Witnesses recalled nothing remarkable. He appeared calm, polite, focused. The next piece of the timeline arrived 2 weeks later. His car was discovered abandoned at the Oss service station, near the same bridge he had crossed earlier. Inside were personal belongings, including his passport, credit cards, and clothing. The keys were gone. The fuel tank was nearly empty. The car looked as if someone had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Authorities searched the surrounding area. The steep drop below the bridge had long fueled speculation, but no body was ever recovered. Tides in that region were unpredictable, powerful enough to hide almost anything. But even so, the absence of physical evidence left investigators uneasy. It felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing more than one piece. Friends, bandmates, and fans began trying to assemble the fragments of his final days. Richie had always been complex, open in some ways, deeply private in others. His struggles with depression, self-harm, and the pressures of fame were well known within his circle. But he also possessed a deep, philosophical focus that sometimes made him appear distant, unreachable. In the weeks before he vanished, he had withdrawn more than usual. Conversations trailed off into silence. Plans were made, then discarded. He seemed restless, not desperate, just untethered. He left no note, no message, no explanation. Police interviewed anyone who might offer insight. Bandmates described his intelligence, his sensitivity, his ability to articulate pain in ways that felt almost literary. Friends mentioned his impulsiveness, his devotion to books, the piles of literature that filled his apartment. Some said he had spoken vaguely about wanting distance from the industry. Others remembered small comments that now felt loaded with meaning. But none of these fragments produced clarity. Within days, sightings began pouring in. Some claimed they saw him in Newport, walking alone near a bus depot. Others said they spotted him in Bristol, sitting quietly in a corner cafe. One report placed him on the islands of Fuerteventura, another in Goa. A few said they saw him in Wales, wandering streets he knew well. None of the sightings were ever verified. As months turned into years, the disappearance grew into one of the most enduring mysteries in modern British pop culture. Richie became a symbol, not of tragedy, exactly, but of uncertainty. A man who stepped out of the frame and vanished into a world too large to follow. Investigators revisited the case periodically. They reviewed files, revisited interviews, and rechecked old leads. Yet nothing emerged. The timeline remained unchanged. The evidence remained sparse. It was as though Richie had drifted into some quiet place beyond reach. The city of Cardiff held its breath for a long time afterward. Friends left messages on his old answering machine. Fans visited spots he once favored. His family struggled to balance hope with reality. Some believed he may have harmed himself. Others believed he walked away intentionally, seeking a life without the weight of the identity that fame forced upon him. By the late 2000s, a legal question lingered, whether he should be declared presumed dead. His family eventually agreed, though the decision felt more administrative than emotional. On paper, it provided closure. In life, it didn't change much. Richie remained missing. His story remained open. Years later, new theories continued to circulate quietly. Some suggested he had crossed the bridge on foot, slipping into the waters below. Others believed he may have hidden within the vast rural stretches of Wales, living simply and anonymously. A few held to the idea that he traveled farther, perhaps even abroad. None of these theories gained traction. None of them explained everything. What remained were the simple, unadorned pieces of fact. A man leaves a hotel, drives home, crosses a bridge, abandons his car, and disappears. Time has a way of smoothing the sharper edges of a mystery. But in Richie's case, the edges stayed intact. The unanswered questions remained as clear as they were in 1995. There was no final moment to mark, no turning point, no grand revelation hidden in a forgotten file. Just silence. And that silence followed the band as well. His friends continued playing music, carrying his memory lightly but persistently, not as an image frozen in time, but as a presence threaded through their work. Next up are the Claremont serial killings, Australia, 1996 to 1997. This story takes us to Western Australia in the mid-1990s, to the upscale suburb of Claremont, a place known for its quiet streets, nightlife spots, and a sense of safety that residents rarely questioned. Young people gathered at pubs along Stirling Highway, met friends near the busy taxi ranks, and moved through familiar routines without concern. But over 2 summers, something disturbing unfolded in the shadows between those well-lit streets. 3 women vanished without explanation, disappearing between closing bars and a short walk home. The city searched for answers, but none came easily. This is the story of the Claremont serial killings, a case that left Perth uneasy for decades. Claremont in the 1990s felt orderly and comfortable, an area where professionals lived, where students met for drinks, and where late-night crowds flowed predictably from one venue to another. The bright signs of the Continental Hotel, and the Bay View Club glowed over bustling footpaths. Taxi lines wrapped around the corners on weekends, with people joking, waiting, and planning their next stop. On the night of January 26, 1996, 23-year-old Sarah Spears left the Continental Hotel after spending the evening with friends. She stepped outside into warm summer air, the kind that made nights stretch on longer than they should. Sarah called for a taxi from a public phone booth, a normal routine, one she'd done many times before. When the call ended, she waited at the corner of Sterling Highway and Sterling Road. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The next morning, when Sarah didn't show up to work and didn't answer her phone, her family grew worried. Calls were made, friends checked their messages, and soon police were involved. Officers traced her steps from the bar to the phone booth, interviewed taxi drivers, and canvassed the neighborhood. But nothing turned up. No witnesses had noticed anything unusual. No cars sped away. No sounds of struggle echoed through the night. Sarah's disappearance felt like a strange, tragic anomaly, but no one imagined what would follow. Just 5 months later, on June 9, 1996, another young woman disappeared, 27-year-old Jane Rimmer. Jane was cheerful, dependable, and well known to friends and coworkers. That night she had gone out with a small group, visiting cafes and eventually returning to Claremont's night scene. As the evening wound down, Jane stood outside the Continental Hotel, smiling and chatting. A CCTV camera caught her briefly, showing a moment that would later become haunting. Jane standing alone, glancing to her left, and then stepping out of frame. That was the last image of her alive. When Jane didn't return home, her family immediately alerted authorities. The disappearance of 2 women from the same nightlife district within months of each other sent a shock through the city. Police surged resources into the area, interviewing staff, checking security footage, bringing in additional patrols. Posters appeared on telephone poles, bus shelters, and shop windows. The search for Jane continued for weeks, stretching into the winter. Then, on August 3, 1996, a worker passing through bushland in Wellard noticed something unusual hidden among low shrubs. Police arrived and confirmed the worst. Jane's remains had been found. The calmness of that area contrasted sharply with the violence of the act. The isolation, the silence, the careful placement of the body suggested someone who knew how to move unnoticed. The mood in Perth changed dramatically. What once felt impossible, the idea of a predator operating in one of the city's safest districts, now seemed undeniable. Still, investigators lacked direction. There were no obvious suspects, no clear pattern beyond the abductions, no evidence linking a single vehicle or person. The bars and streets were busy every weekend, hundreds of people coming and going. A needle in a haystack didn't begin to describe the search. Months passed. Patrols increased, warnings circulated, and people became careful in ways they never had before. Friends avoided walking alone. Women kept to well-lit areas, carried phones, or chose to leave clubs early. Yet beneath the caution, life in Claremont continued, because it had to. On March 15, 1997, the nightmare repeated. Sierra Glennon, a 27-year-old lawyer, had been out celebrating a co-worker's event. She left the Continental Hotel just after midnight and began walking along Sterling Highway, likely planning to catch a taxi or head home on foot. She was confident, independent, and aware of the increased concern around town, but the streets didn't feel dangerous. People walked past her, traffic moved steadily, and the night seemed ordinary. Sierra never came home. Her family reported her missing almost immediately. Police reacted with urgency, deploying helicopter searches, diving teams, and roadblocks. It felt like time had folded back on itself. The same streets, the same questions, the same fear creeping through the city. 3 weeks later, on April 3rd, 1997, a bushwalker north of Perth stumbled upon remains in a remote scrub area near Eglinton. Authorities confirmed they belonged to Sierra. Like Jane's case, the location was out of the way, carefully chosen, and deeply unsettling. Now there were 3 victims, all young, all abducted from the same nightlife area. all taken while trying to get home. The city no longer whispered about a serial predator. It openly accepted one was moving through their nights, choosing victims with precision. The major investigation team, known as Macro, was formed, one of Australia's largest and most expensive police operations. Dozens of detectives joined, supported by forensic experts, analysts, and community reporting lines that never stopped ringing. The case stretched on for years, evolving with new leads, false starts, and frustrating dead ends. Early suspects came and went. Some were cleared after long interrogations, others through alibis or forensic testing. Police gathered countless hours of footage, interviewed hundreds of Claremont employees, taxi drivers, friends, families, and former coworkers of both victims and potential suspects. Nothing solid emerged. Years passed. The city grew. People moved on with their lives, yet the shadow of the Claremont case stayed. For many, it became something spoken about quietly, like a warning passed down without details, a memory of a time when the streets didn't feel as safe as they once had. The case remained unsolved deep into the 2000s, then the early 2010s. But investigators never stopped working. Advances in forensic science, especially around DNA and fiber analysis, pushed the case forward slowly, like a tide rising inch by inch. Then, in 2016, 20 years after the first disappearance, police made a breakthrough. A man named Bradley Robert Edwards, a former Telstra technician, was arrested at his home in Kewdale. His connection to the case had come from meticulous forensic work involving fibers found on Sierra and Jane's clothing, matching them to materials used in uniforms and seat coverings associated with Edwards' workplace. Additional DNA evidence linked him to earlier unrelated assaults, building a portrait of someone capable of escalating violence. The arrest stunned Perth. After decades of uncertainty, a name finally emerged from the silence. Edwards was charged with the murders of Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon. Although investigators believed he was responsible for Sarah Spears' disappearance as well, the remains had never been found, and the evidence was not strong enough to secure a conviction in that case. The trial began in 2019, a detailed, precise examination of evidence that had been preserved, retested, studied, and reinterpreted across 2 decades. Witnesses recounted their memories of nights long past. Forensic experts described microscopic fibers, complex DNA profiles, and small clues that had survived years of degradation. Every detail mattered. In 2020, Edwards was found guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Sierra Glennon. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. For Sarah Spears' family, the case remained painfully unresolved, her resting place unknown. Yet the trial brought answers that had been missing for so long, answers that felt almost unreachable. Today, Claremont looks much like any other calm, lively suburb. The nightlife continues. People gather in pubs, taxis line up outside clubs, and the streets buzz on warm evenings. But for many residents who lived through the late 1990s, certain corners of Sterling Highway carry quiet memories. A moment of hesitation before stepping away from the crowd, a glance over the shoulder, a reminder of what once unfolded when the city wasn't watching closely enough. What began as routine nights out became a story etched into Perth's history, shaped by long searches, persistent investigators, and families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. The Claremont serial killings remain one of Australia's most unsettling cases, not only for the crimes themselves, but for how long the questions lingered before the truth finally surfaced. Next story, the Hall Mills murders, New Brunswick, New Jersey, 1922. The next case takes us to the American Northeast in the early 1920s, a time of moonlit jazz halls, prohibition-era secrets, and neighborhoods where reputations mattered as much as survival. In New Brunswick, New Jersey, the streets felt predictable, steady, safe enough that people walked home without worry. But beneath that sense of order lived a quiet tangle of secrets, affairs, rivalries, and whispered rumors. And on a warm September night in 1922, those whispers became a nationwide sensation when 2 bodies were found beneath a tree on a lonely stretch of farmland. arranged with unsettling care, surrounded by clues so theatrical they almost seemed staged. What followed would become one of the strangest, most publicized murder mysteries in American history, one that the courts could never settle, and that still echoes like a half-finished sentence a century later. The discovery happened on the morning of September 16th. A couple walking through the orchard near DeRussey's Lane came across the bodies of a man and a woman lying side by side in the grass. Their clothing was neat, almost ceremonially arranged. The man's arm rested under the woman's shoulders, as though posing for a portrait. Torn love letters, dozens of them, were scattered around their bodies like confetti. The victims were identified quickly. Edward Hall, a respected Episcopal minister, and Eleanor Mills, a choir singer from his parish. Their secret relationship was known to some, suspected by others, but never openly discussed. Now, laid out in the open as though placed deliberately for the world to witness, the truth was impossible to ignore. The scene was bizarre in its precision. Edward had a single gunshot wound to the head. Eleanor's injuries were far more violent. Multiple gunshots, slashes across her throat, wounds suggesting she had been attacked at extremely close range. Whoever killed them had taken time afterward, positioning their bodies, arranging their clothing, laying out the love letters that Eleanor had kept hidden for years. The press descended immediately. Reporters treated the orchard like a stage. The public devoured every detail, every rumor, every hint of scandal. And behind the frenzy, the investigators quietly focused on one name: Frances Hall, Edward's wife. Frances was known for her calm demeanor and old family wealth. But beneath that gentility, there were stories of possessiveness, bruising arguments behind closed doors, and a fierce loyalty to the Hall family name. She denied any involvement. She insisted she had been at home the entire night. Her two brothers supported her, offering an alibi so tight it was almost rehearsed. Yet neighbors whispered. Servants overheard raised voices in the Hall household. Some even claimed they saw Frances and her brothers driving toward the orchard that night. A pig farmer swore he saw 4 shadowy figures near the murder scene. A woman walking her dog insisted she heard screams in the dark. The problem was that none of the witnesses could agree on the details: faces, clothing, the timing of the footsteps, or voices. Everyone had glimpsed something, but no one had seen enough. The case dragged for years as investigators sifted through gossip and inconsistencies. Then came the strangest turn. A new witness appeared. A woman named Jane Gibson, known locally as the Pig Woman. She claimed she had been riding her mule near the orchard on the night of the murders. She said she saw multiple figures arguing under the crabapple tree. She claimed she heard a woman cry out, "Don't." She claimed she saw a gun flash. Her testimony electrified the public, but also raised eyebrows. Her story changed with each retelling. The number of people she saw shifted. The tone of the voices shifted. Even the direction she approached from shifted. Supporters believed she was simply frightened and trying her best. Skeptics believed she was enjoying the attention. Eventually, Frances Hall and her brothers were arrested and put on trial in 1926, for years after the murders. The courtroom became a spectacle, filled with reporters, spectators, and curious locals who lined up at dawn to get inside. It felt less like a trial and more like a drama unfolding on a stage where everyone wanted a front row seat. Jane Gibson was brought in on a hospital bed, too ill to sit upright. Her testimony was emotional, winding, intense, but under cross-examination, it frayed. The defense attacked every inconsistency. They argued she misunderstood what she saw, or that she saw nothing at all. One by one, the prosecution's points eroded. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: not guilty. The Hall Mills murders slipped into legend. No one else was ever charged. Frances faded from the public eye. Eleanor Mills' family carried the weight of unanswered questions, and the orchard on DeRussey's Lane returned to silence, but a different kind of silence than before. Over time, locals said there was something lingering there. People spoke of walking the lane at dusk and feeling watched, as if someone were still standing beneath the branches, waiting for the truth to surface. Some said they felt a sudden drop in temperature when approaching the old crabapple tree. Others, when crossing the field on moonlit nights, thought they saw two figures lying in the grass, side by side, vanishing the moment they stepped closer. Whether these were tricks of the imagination or echoes of a century-old crime, no one could be certain. But in New Brunswick, the Hall Mills murders remain a story half covered in shadow, a mystery that refuses to settle, a puzzle locked behind conflicting voices and fading memories. A case where the truth feels close, but always just out of reach. Next story. The Peasenhall Murder, Suffolk, England, 1902. Our story moves now to the quiet farmlands of rural Suffolk at the turn of the 20th century. A place of rolling fields, stone cottages, and slow, predictable rhythms of village life. Yet in the spring of 1902, those rhythms were shattered when a single violent act turned a peaceful community into the center of one of Britain's strangest, most debated murder cases. A killing without clear motive, without clear evidence, and without a clear ending. A case that still sits in a fog of doubt more than a century later. Peasenhall was the kind of English village where everyone knew everyone else. Families worked in the same field for generations, and news traveled faster than the morning carts. At the center of one of these cottages lived Rose Harsen, a 22-year-old servant girl known for her quiet nature and diligence. She slept in a small upstairs room, earning a modest wage while helping with household chores. On the morning of May 1st, 1902, the tranquility of the village cracked. Rose was found lying at the foot of the stairs inside the cottage where she worked. She had been stabbed multiple times, her night dress soaked, the floor around her scorched by a small fire someone had tried to ignite, as if attempting to burn away the truth. A broken lamp lay nearby. The scene was brutal but strangely controlled, with hints that the attacker had come prepared, knowing exactly where to go and how to leave as little trace as possible. Whispers began immediately. Rose had been pregnant, something that carried enormous stigma in a small rural community. Even more troubling were rumors of a secret acquaintance with William Gardiner, a well-known church elder and married man whose reputation, until then, had been spotless. The two had allegedly been seen speaking privately weeks earlier. Some villagers claimed Rose had kept a letter from him, summoning her to the cottage on the night she died. The authorities seized on this possibility. Gardiner was questioned intensely. He denied everything, denied any relationship, denied writing any letter, denied ever stepping foot near the cottage that night. His family swore he had been home, but the rumors wouldn't fade. Soon the village had divided into two camps. Those convinced he was guilty, and those who believed he was the target of gossip and superstition. A scapegoat chosen simply because no other suspect existed. The trial that followed became a spectacle. Lawyers dissected the smallest details, the angle of the wounds, the state of the lamp, the faint footprints, the mysterious letter that conveniently disappeared. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some claimed they saw Gardiner walking in the dark that night. Others insisted he never left his home. The courtroom buzzed with theories, secret meetings, jealousy, moral panic, even suggestions of multiple attackers. But there was no certainty. At the end of deliberations, jurors found themselves hopelessly split. A second trial fared no better. The evidence was thin, the motive foggy, the community's whispers heavy but unproven. Gardiner walked free, legally innocent, but never truly cleared in the eyes of many. He left Peasenhall soon after, his reputation permanently marked by a crime that the law could not solve and the village could not forget. Meanwhile, the cottage stood in uneasy silence. People avoided walking past it after sundown. Some said the house carried an unnatural stillness, as if holding its breath. Stories circulated about faint footsteps on the staircase, or the glow of a lamp in the window when no lamp was inside. Whether these were exaggerations born from fear or something more, no one could say. Over time, the fields grew taller, families moved, and the world around Peasenhall changed. But the murder never escaped its soil. More than 100 years later, historians still revisit the case, poring over old testimonies and faded photographs. trying to understand what happened in that small upstairs room. A crime so sudden, so personal, yet so unclear. Frozen in a moment where truth slipped between the cracks. And in Hall, some villagers still say that on cool spring nights, when the wind moved through the hedgerows just right, you can hear the creak of old wooden steps as though someone is descending them slowly, carefully, looking for something or someone lost to time. Next story, Lockerbie bombing, Pan Am Flight 103, Scotland, 1988. On a cold December evening in 1988, the small town of Lockerbie, Scotland, was cloaked in early winter darkness. Snow dusted the hillsides. The streets were quiet, and most residents had long since retreated to their homes after a day of routine work and chores. Yet, over the North Atlantic, a transatlantic flight was beginning a journey that would end in tragedy and leave a scar on the world that would take decades to understand fully. Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 named Clipper made of the seas, departed from London's Heathrow Airport bound for New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. On board were 259 passengers and crew members, an assortment of families, business travelers, and vacationers, each engrossed in their own lives, conversations, or quiet reflections. The flight initially proceeded without incident, engines humming steadily, the cabin lights dimmed for overnight comfort. In Lockerbie, the lives of the townspeople went on, unaware of the looming disaster. Some were tending to late chores, others walking dogs through the frost-covered fields, and a few were catching the last buses home. Around 7:03 p.m., the first signs of catastrophe appeared. A thunderous explosion, a shockwave that rattled windows and sent shards of debris across a wide radius. In the blink of an eye, the aircraft broke apart in midair, scattering wreckage across the Scottish countryside. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Burning sections of the plane fell from the sky, landing on rooftops, streets, and open fields. Fires ignited, smoke filled the winter air, and local emergency services were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. Rescue teams moved through the snow, discovering the grim evidence of hundreds of lives lost. The town, quiet and peaceful moments before, was suddenly a scene of horror. Families, neighbors, and first responders alike grappled with the enormity of the event. Investigators quickly determined that the disaster was not accidental. The pattern of wreckage and the evidence recovered from the scene indicated an explosion aboard the aircraft. Forensic teams meticulously pieced together fragments of luggage, clothing, and other debris, reconstructing the events that had led to the catastrophic breakup in midair. Among the recovered items was a fragment of a timer, consistent with devices used in improvised explosive devices, a key piece in unraveling the mystery. Suspicion soon turned to international terrorism. Tracing the components of the bomb led investigators through a complex web of intelligence and covert operations. It became clear that the attack had been orchestrated to target civilians, a politically motivated act designed to spread fear and achieve objectives far from the quiet fields of Lockerbie. Through painstaking detective work, authorities focused on Libyan intelligence operatives with links to the bombing. The investigation revealed that the explosive device had been concealed inside a suitcase, placed among other luggage, and loaded onto the aircraft without raising suspicion. The meticulous planning reflected both technical knowledge and cold calculation. Every step, from manufacturing the device to circumventing airport security, had been executed with precision. By the early 2000s, years of investigation and international diplomacy culminated in the identification of Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer. He was accused of masterminding the attack, coordinating logistics, and ensuring that the bomb was placed on the flight. The prosecution assembled a detailed account, drawing from intercepted communications, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence recovered from the wreckage and luggage. The trial, held in the Netherlands under Scottish law for neutrality and security, captured the attention of the global community. Testimonies recounted the technical aspects of the bomb, the steps al-Megrahi took to evade detection, and the devastating human consequences. Families of victims described personal losses, the empty chairs at holiday dinners, the unfinished projects, and the dreams that had abruptly ended in flight. Their grief was palpable, carried into the courtroom and across continents through media coverage. In 2001, Abdelbasset Al-Megrahi was convicted of 270 counts of murder. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of the crime and the immense scale of loss. Appeals and legal debates continued for years, encompassing issues of evidence, procedural fairness, and political pressure. Despite these complexities, the case provided a measure of closure for some of the families, though the memories of that night in December remained indelible. The bombing also led to significant changes in aviation security. Airlines and airports around the world implemented stricter luggage screening protocols, developed new techniques for detecting explosives, and coordinated intelligence operations internationally to prevent similar attacks. Lockerbie became a somber benchmark for aviation terrorism, a tragedy that reshaped the rules and understanding of passenger safety. Local residents, many of whom were first responders, carried the memory of the event for the rest of their lives. Their stories, shared in interviews and memoirs, detailed the surreal experience of waking to destruction in a town that had moments before seemed untouched by global events. The image of charred wreckage against snow-covered fields, the mingling of fire and frost, became etched in collective memory. Despite the horror, some human stories emerged. Strangers rescuing neighbors, coordinated efforts to manage fires and injuries, and the meticulous efforts of investigators who refused to allow the lives lost to fade into anonymity. Each fragment recovered from the scene became a testament to the lives that had existed aboard the plane, a mosaic of loss that demanded attention and action. Lockerbie today retains its quiet, rural character, the landscape scarred yet healing over time. Memorials to the victims have been erected, honoring their memory with names etched in stone and ceremonies held annually. The Pan Am Flight 103 disaster remains a stark reminder of the vulnerability of civilian life to acts of terrorism, the relentless pursuit of justice across borders, and the ways meticulous planning can collide with human tragedy. Even decades later, those who study aviation security, international terrorism, and forensic investigation view Lockerbie as a defining case. The details meticulously uncovered continue to educate and caution, ensuring that the story of Flight 103, its passengers, crew, and the tiny Scottish town that bore witness is never forgotten. The cold December sky may no longer echo with fire and debris, but the lessons remain. Next story, murder of Riva Steenkamp, South Africa, 2013. The city of Pretoria, South Africa, had a certain rhythm in the early hours of Valentine's Day, February 14, 2013. Streetlights hummed above quiet suburban roads, the occasional car punctuating the darkness with its headlights sweeping across manicured lawns. Inside one modern townhouse in the neighborhood of Tuinzicht, a young woman prepared for a night she likely imagined as ordinary. Dinner, maybe a quiet evening, perhaps plans with a partner. That young woman was Riva Steenkamp, a 29-year-old model and television personality, ambitious, vibrant, and deeply engaged in her career and personal life. Her life was on the rise, but within a matter of hours, it would be tragically and violently cut short. Riva lived with an energy that drew people to her. She had friends, mentors, and colleagues who admired her, not only for her beauty, but for her intelligence, her warmth, and her determination. Her public persona was one of poise, charm, and resilience. Those who knew her personally saw a mix of humor, intellect, and kindness. It was this combination, both ordinary and extraordinary, that made her disappearance so impossible for friends and family to fathom. That night, Riva was at home with Oscar Pistorius, an internationally renowned Paralympic athlete. Known as the Blade Runner, Pistorius had earned fame for his achievements on the track, overcoming the challenges of double amputation to compete at the highest levels of sport, including the Olympic Games. To the public, he was a hero. To those inside the home that evening, he was an intimate partner, someone Riva trusted. Yet the boundaries of trust, once crossed, can quickly transform safety into danger. Around 3 a.m., neighbors reported hearing gunshots. The sounds shattered the usual suburban calm. Some thought they might be fireworks, but the rhythm, the repetition, and the muffled urgency suggested something far darker. Emergency services were called, and officers arrived to find Pistorius outside the house, injured himself, claiming that an intruder had entered the home. Inside, they discovered Riva's Steenkamp, critically wounded, lying on a bathroom floor. The scene was chaotic, but investigators began their methodical work immediately. They documented bullet trajectories, shell casings, and points of entry. Riva had been shot 4 times through a closed bathroom door. The stark reality emerged. Someone had fired through the door with lethal intent, and the person behind the gun was Pistorius himself. The story that would dominate international headlines was only beginning to unfold. Pistorius initially claimed that he had mistaken Riva for a burglar. He described panic, fear, and instinctive action, the culmination of a sudden confrontation that led to irreversible tragedy. Forensic teams and ballistics experts meticulously reconstructed the event, examining angles, distances, and the layout of the house. Blood spatter patterns, gunshot residue, and trajectory reports painted a narrative that both supported and contradicted Pistorius' account. The public reaction was instantaneous. News outlets worldwide covered the story with relentless intensity, dissecting every detail, every past interview, every photograph, every public appearance. South Africans debated the tragedy, celebrities commented, and social media amplified every claim, every contradiction. The case was no longer a private grief. It had become a global spectacle, scrutinized from every angle, debated in every corner of the internet. As the investigation deepened, the police focused on motive, opportunity, and behavior. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Forensic evidence became central. The bullet holes, the trajectory through the bathroom door, and the nature of the wounds suggested that the shots were fired in rapid succession, with remarkable precision. Investigators noted inconsistencies in Pistorius' statements, prompting further interrogation and analysis. The ensuing trial, which captivated the world, revealed complexities in both human relationships and legal interpretation. Pistorius' legal team framed the shooting as an accident, a tragic mistake born of fear. The prosecution painted a different picture, emphasizing intent, patterns of behavior, and the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. Witnesses described the relationship between Pistorius and Steenkamp as passionate but occasionally tense, with disagreements and arguments that, while normal in some relationships, suggested underlying instability. Forensic psychologists testified, exploring how perception, fear, and adrenaline can influence human action. Gun experts demonstrated how rapid firing at a closed door through a confined bathroom space could have different outcomes based on posture, angle, and intention. Every detail was scrutinized: the type of firearm, the bullets, the timestamps, and even Pistorius' previous behavior under stress. The courtroom became a place of meticulous reconstruction, each moment replayed, analyzed, and challenged. Families were forced to relive the tragedy repeatedly. Riva's mother and father, who had supported her throughout her life, faced the unimaginable task of observing every detail of her death presented in graphic, analytical terms. They spoke publicly, emphasizing the importance of accountability and remembrance. Friends shared memories of her laughter, her work ethic, and her vibrant personality, ensuring that the young woman behind the headlines remained human, real, and remembered. Pistorius was initially convicted of culpable homicide, later reclassified to murder on appeal. Sentencing debates, legal challenges, and procedural nuances extended the trial over months. South Africa's judicial system became a global focus as commentators from every continent weighed in on verdicts, appeals, and procedural decisions. The case illustrated the tension between public perception, media influence, and the measured rigor of legal proceedings. For the public, the Steenkamp case was more than a crime. It was a study of trust betrayed, fame intersecting with tragedy, and the fragility of life even within spaces deemed safe: bedrooms, homes, familiar surroundings. International audiences followed each hearing, each testimony, and each appeal with a mix of fascination, horror, and a desire to understand how something so ordinary, a domestic space, a relationship, a Valentine's night, could become a site of irreversible violence. In the aftermath, Riva's legacy extended beyond grief. Charitable organizations were established in her memory, promoting awareness about domestic violence, firearm safety, and support for young women navigating personal and professional pressures. Advocates emphasize the importance of listening to warning signs, maintaining safety, and recognizing patterns of behavior that could escalate into harm. Riva's story, tragic as it was, became a catalyst for dialogue, education, and prevention. The murder of Riva Steenkamp remains one of South Africa's most widely discussed modern crimes. The quiet streets of Tuinzig have since returned to normal rhythms. Neighbors speak in hushed tones about that night, the flashing police lights, the lingering presence of tragedy. Yet for those who knew Riva personally, for her family, and for the public who followed every moment, the story of that Valentine's night remains vivid. Next story: the murder of Charles Bravo, Balham, London, 1876. The next case takes us deep into Victorian London, a world of dimly lit drawing rooms, narrow brick lanes, horse-drawn carriages gliding through evening fog, and homes where appearances mattered more than truth. In wealthy neighborhoods like Balham, life moved at a quiet, orderly pace. Servants kept the lamps burning, the windows polished, the carpets immaculate. Every household had a reputation to protect. Every secret was carefully wrapped in etiquette and silence. But on an April night in 1876, inside a handsome home known as the Priory, a young barrister named Charles Bravo staggered from his bedroom, collapsed on a landing, and whispered words that would ignite one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in British history. Within hours, the house filled with panic, doctors, and whispers. Within days, newspapers were calling it the Balham Mystery. Within months, it became a national obsession. And more than a century later, the question remains unchanged. Who poisoned Charles Bravo? It began quietly, almost unremarkably. Charles Bravo had finished dinner with his wife, Florence, and a couple who were staying as guests. The household moved through the usual evening routine. Servants cleaned dishes. Lamps were dimmed. The long corridors fell silent. Shortly before midnight, something happened in Charles's room. Something violent enough that he lurched into the hallway, clutching the banister, unable to stand. His voice was strained, barely audible, but desperate. He tried to call out, but the words didn't come easily. Finally, a servant heard him collapse and rushed to help. He was sweating, trembling, his face contorted in agony. When Florence and the guests reached him, they found him barely conscious. One of them asked what was wrong. Charles whispered, "I have been poisoned." The doctors who arrived were baffled. His symptoms pointed to something corrosive, something that burned from the inside. Over the next hours, he drifted in and out of awareness, racked with waves of pain. What he had taken, where it came from, or who had given it to him, he couldn't say. He was certain only of one thing: he had not done it to himself. It took 3 days for the poison to finish its work. When he finally slipped away, the entire house was already under scrutiny. The inquest revealed the cause: antimony, in the form of tartar emetic, a compound that had been in the house, used occasionally to treat horses. In the Victorian household, there were only a handful of people with access to it, and each one had a reason to be suspected. Florence Bravo, Charles's wife, had a complicated past. Before marrying Charles, she had been entangled in a long affair with a wealthy doctor named James Gully, a relationship that scandalized London when it became public. Florence and Gully had ended things abruptly when she remarried, but rumors insisted the connection was not fully severed. Charles, for his part, was known to be strict, controlling, and often cold. Servants whispered about arguments behind closed doors. There were stories of jealousy, tension, and resentment. People wondered whether their marriage, barely 4 months old, had already begun to rot from within. Then there was Mrs. Fox, the housekeeper. Intelligent, sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal to Florence, she seemed to dislike Charles from the beginning. According to some accounts, she believed Charles mistreated her mistress and deserved a firm lesson, though whether she was capable of murder was a different question entirely. Finally, there was the possibility that Charles had taken the poison himself, whether by accident or intention. But the more investigators studied the case, the more unlikely that theory became. He had no reason to harm himself. His career was stable, his finances secure, his future bright. And the way he collapsed, sudden, immediate, suggested the poison had been administered in a concentrated dose, not sipped casually or swallowed by mistake. The inquest became front-page news across England. Reporters camped outside the priory. Cartoons and editorials painted Florence as either a victim or a villain. Dr. Gully's name surfaced again and again, despite his insistence that he had no involvement and had not even visited the priory that spring. Every testimony only deepened the mystery. One servant insisted she heard footsteps near Charles's room at midnight. Another swore that Florence had cried before bed, trembling after an argument. A third claimed Mrs. Fox had acted strangely the next morning, her hands shaking as she poured tea. But none of it was enough. There was no confession, no clear motive, no witness who saw the poison delivered. Eventually, the coroner reached a conclusion that shocked the public. Charles Bravo was murdered by someone in the house, but the jury could not say who. The case closed without resolution. Florence left the country soon after, shaken and humiliated by the accusations. She died only 2 years later, worn down by illness and grief. Dr. Gully's career never recovered. Mrs. Fox disappeared from the public eye, her reputation forever stained. The priory itself stood silent for years, eventually sold, renovated, and passed from family to family. But the story didn't fade. People in Balham spoke quietly about that night for generations. Some said the priory held an atmosphere that was difficult to describe. A heaviness in certain rooms, a sudden chill in the hallway where Charles collapsed. Later occupants claimed they occasionally heard footsteps when the house was empty, or that the landing creaked as though someone were leaning on the banister, trying to steady themselves. Over time, the case became a kind of ghost story wrapped around a real tragedy. Not because of spirits or apparitions, but because of something far more unsettling. The sense of unfinished business, a narrative with its final chapter missing. Even now, researchers argue about the truth. Some believe Florence acted in desperation. Others are convinced Mrs. Fox had both motive and opportunity. A small group still suspects Dr. Gully orchestrated it from a distance. And a few argue Charles may have poisoned himself accidentally, though nothing in the evidence comfortably supports that theory. What remains is the atmosphere of the priory on that April night. The quiet corridors, the dim glow of the lamps, the sudden sound of a man stumbling from his room, and the final whisper he gave before collapsing. "I have been poisoned," a sentence that still hangs in the air, unresolved, like the last line of a story waiting to be finished. Next story, Elizabeth Lyon, Edgeworth Bess, England, 18th century. The moors and villages of 18th century Lancashire were remote, rough, and often cut off by weather and distance. Among these isolated communities, gossip, suspicion, and superstition flourished. It was here that Elizabeth Lyon, later known as Edgeworth Bess, became notorious for a series of poisonings that would terrify locals and make her name infamous across the region. Elizabeth was born in the early 1700s, the daughter of modest farmers. From the beginning, she learned the hardships of rural life: harsh weather, hard labor, and the constant struggle to survive in a community that demanded resilience. By the time she reached adulthood, Elizabeth had married and begun a family of her own, integrating herself into village life. Outwardly, she appeared industrious and caring, tending to household and farm duties with diligence. Yet beneath that facade lurked a dark pattern. Elizabeth began to poison those around her, using arsenic, a common and easily obtained substance at the time. Victims included family members, neighbors, and friends. At first, deaths were subtle, presenting as illness or sudden fevers. In a time when medical understanding was limited, such deaths often went unquestioned, allowing Elizabeth to act without immediate suspicion. Her first recorded victim was a relative who fell ill after consuming food prepared by Elizabeth. The symptoms, vomiting, abdominal pain, and weakness, were consistent with arsenic poisoning, though the cause went undetected. Over time, similar deaths occurred in her social circle, often after meals she prepared or drinks she offered. The pattern grew, and whispers of foul play began to circulate in the small village, though fear and respect prevented immediate confrontation. Elizabeth's methods were careful and calculated. She used her position within the household and community to gain access to her victims, administering poison in small doses over time. This approach created prolonged illness rather than instant death, making each case appear natural and reducing the likelihood of detection. The precision of her actions revealed both patience and a chilling understanding of human physiology. Neighbors eventually became suspicious when multiple people in Elizabeth's household fell ill under similar circumstances. Rumors of Edgeworth Bess circulated in taverns, markets, and churches. Some dismissed them as jealousy or superstition, while others quietly feared her presence. By the time authorities became involved, the pattern of deaths could no longer be ignored. Bodies were exhumed and examined, revealing arsenic in multiple cases, confirming suspicions and sparking outrage. Elizabeth Lyon was arrested and brought to trial, her demeanor calm and composed throughout the proceedings. Witnesses described her care for the sick, her presence during each death, and the unusual frequency of misfortune around her. Testimony, combined with forensic evidence of arsenic, built a compelling case. The trial was widely reported in local newspapers, attracting attention from surrounding counties and beyond. During the trial, Elizabeth maintained her innocence, claiming that deaths were the result of natural causes. However, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Autopsies confirmed arsenic poisoning, and witness statements highlighted her presence and access to victims at critical moments. Her reputation as a caring woman, once her shield, became a source of horror as the contrast between her public persona and the crimes attributed to her became undeniable. The verdict was guilty, and Elizabeth Lyon was sentenced to death. Her execution, carried out publicly, drew crowds from neighboring villages eager to witness justice. For many, it was both spectacle and cautionary tale, a vivid reminder of how danger could hide behind domestic normalcy. The story of Edgeworth Bess became part of local folklore, retold for decades in whispers and warning tales. Historians later examined her case in detail, noting the methods, motives, and social conditions that allowed her crimes to continue for so long. Arsenic's availability, combined with limited medical knowledge and the social authority granted to women in domestic spaces, created the perfect environment for repeated poisonings. Elizabeth Lyon exploited these factors with patience and cunning, ensuring her actions remained undetected until the pattern was undeniable. The victims of Edgeworth Bess were largely ordinary villagers, people who trusted her and accepted her care. Their deaths left families devastated, neighbors fearful, and the community shaken. Elizabeth's crimes disrupted the ordinary rhythms of rural life, transforming familiar spaces, kitchens, dining tables, and homes into sites of fear and uncertainty. Every meal became a potential threat, and trust became a luxury that few could afford. Public fascination with her case was intense. Ballads and pamphlets recounted the details of her crimes, describing the careful administration of poison, the suffering of her victims, and the eventual capture and punishment of the perpetrator. Her story became emblematic of a type of crime that relied on patience, secrecy, and social manipulation rather than overt violence. The psychological impact on the community was profound, leaving a legacy of fear and caution. Elizabeth Lyon's story also highlights the vulnerabilities of rural communities in 18th century England. Isolation, reliance on domestic labor, and limited medical knowledge allowed a murderer to operate in plain sight. The social structure, where women were entrusted with household management and care of family members, was both respected and exploited, demonstrating how trust could be weaponized in ways that went unnoticed until it was too late. The tale of Edgeworth Bess endured long after her execution. She became a figure of legend in Lancashire, her name synonymous with poison and secrecy. Later generations revisited her story, examining both the criminal acts and the social context that enabled them. Ballads, local histories, and legal records preserve the narrative, ensuring that Elizabeth Lyon's crimes were remembered as both shocking and remarkable for their subtlety and calculation. In a small, remote village, every detail mattered. How a meal was prepared, who had access to the household, and how illness manifested became part of the story that surrounded Elizabeth Lyon. Her ability to remain unnoticed until patterns emerged illustrates a chilling precision. The quiet roads and modest homes of Lancashire concealed acts of deliberate malice, demonstrating how ordinary life could hide extraordinary horror. By the time of her execution, Elizabeth Lyon's identity as Edgeworth Bess had spread across counties. Her story captured the imagination not because of brutality alone, but because of the methodical, almost imperceptible way she committed her crimes. Villagers, and later historians, noted the careful use of arsenic, the patience in administering it, and a reliance on social trust as key elements of her method. Elizabeth Lyon's life and crimes are remembered today as one of the most striking examples of serial poisoning in rural England. Her story shows how domestic authority, access to victims, and subtlety could be combined into a deadly formula. Each death she caused had ripple effects, leaving grief, fear, and lasting fascination in her wake. Next story, the kidnapping of Charlie Ross, United States, 1874. Summer in Philadelphia brought long days, humid afternoons, and the kind of lazy warmth that made children run freely through the streets. Germantown, a quiet and respectable neighborhood at the time, was considered one of the safest places for a family to live. The homes were spaced comfortably apart. Gardens grew wild around wooden fences, and the streets echoed with the laughter of kids who roamed without worry. Among them were two brothers, Charlie Ross, 4 years old, and his older brother Walter, just 6. Their father, Christian Ross, was a well-off businessman. The boys were used to playing in the yard, wandering nearby blocks, stopping by neighbors' homes. Nothing about their childhood suggested danger. But on July 1st, 1874, the peace of Germantown shattered. What happened on that warm afternoon would become the first major kidnapping for ransom case in American history. That day, Charlie and Walter were outside playing near their home when a horse-drawn buggy pulled up. 2 men inside, strangers to the neighborhood, greeted the boys with casual friendliness. They were described later as cheerful, relaxed, and confident, the kind of men who seemed harmless at first glance. They told the boys they had fireworks in the buggy. With the 4th of July just around the corner, the promise of bright explosions and colorful lights was irresistible. The men invited the children to hop in, offering to take them to buy the fireworks. Walter, older and unsure, hesitated, but Charlie, excited and trusting, stepped closer. The men smiled, reassured, coaxed, and eventually both boys climbed in. Neighbors who caught glimpses of the buggy didn't think much of it. Children rode with acquaintances all the time. No one imagined that anything sinister was happening. The buggy moved through the neighborhood at a calm pace, giving no indication of malice. But soon, the men turned down unfamiliar roads. Walter noticed they were heading far from home and began to feel uneasy. After a while, the buggy stopped at a small grocery store. One of the men got out with Walter, pretending to buy the promised fireworks. When they exited the shop, the buggy, with Charlie still inside, was already moving. Walter called out, confused and frightened, but the man beside him held him back. Moments later, the buggy vanished down the road, taking 4-year-old Charlie Ross with it. Walter was left standing alone, crying, holding nothing in his hands except fear and confusion. The man who had walked him into the store quickly disappeared into the crowd. A second later, he was gone. What followed was chaos. Christian Ross rushed home from work to find the police already searching the area. Neighbors combed through streets, fields, shops, and alleys. But Charlie was nowhere. Just days later, the first ransom letter arrived. It was crudely written, filled with misspellings and threats. The kidnappers demanded $20,000, an enormous sum in 1874. If the money wasn't paid, they warned Charlie would never return. This was the first time in American history that ransom notes became part of a kidnapping investigation. Christian Ross, heartbroken but determined, followed instructions carefully. The letters came frequently, each one harsher than the last. The kidnappers instructed Ross to light a candle in a specific window if he agreed to the demands. They told him to deliver money in certain locations and threatened that Charlie would be blinded or killed if the police intervened. The kidnappers' style became familiar. Their poor spelling, strange sentence structures, and inconsistent demands hinted at limited education but strong determination. Meanwhile, the city panicked. Charlie's face appeared in newspapers. For the first time, a child's disappearance became a national story. Posters were printed, circulars distributed, and the Ross home turned into a headquarters for search efforts. Strangers donated money, time, and information. Weeks passed. More notes came. The kidnappers demanded different amounts, changed instructions, and hinted at constant movement. Authorities attempted controlled drops, hid officers along predetermined routes, and conducted surveillance. But every attempt failed. The kidnappers always stayed one step ahead. Public interest in the case skyrocketed. The story appeared in newspapers as far away as California and Europe. Telegraph lines buzzed with rumors and supposed sightings. Some people claimed to have seen Charlie on trains, in hotels, or traveling with suspicious adults. Every lead was investigated and dismissed. The city felt haunted by the image of a missing 4-year-old boy whose fate remained unknown. In November 1874, nearly 5 months after Charlie's disappearance, a break finally came, but not in the way the Ross family hoped. In Brooklyn, New York, 2 burglars broke into a home. The crime quickly turned violent. Police surrounded the building, shots were fired, and both intruders were fatally wounded. As they lay dying, one of them, William Mosher, reportedly confessed to a bystander that he was involved in the kidnapping of Charlie Ross. He said his partner, Joseph Douglas, also participated. But when pressed about Charlie's location, Mosher's words became faint and confused. He died moments later without giving any details. Douglas, critically wounded, could not speak at all. Both men took the truth with them. Investigators quickly confirmed that Mosher and Douglas matched the descriptions given by Walter. Their criminal history, associates, and movements lined up with the timeline of the kidnapping. Police found stolen goods and evidence linking them to a string of burglaries and fraud cases. Everything pointed toward them as the kidnappers. But without a confession or the boy, the case remained unresolved. The death of Mosher and Douglas cut off the only known path to Charlie's recovery. When the news reached Philadelphia, the Ross home fell into devastation. Their only hope had been to follow the kidnappers' letters and instructions. Now the trail went cold in an instant. Despite the loss, Christian Ross refused to stop searching. He spent years interviewing witnesses, traveling to investigate rumors, and speaking to authorities across the country. He visited jails, orphanages, and hospitals, hoping for a clue. For decades, he received letters from people claiming to have seen Charlie. Some were hoaxes, others were genuine misunderstandings. A few children, as adults, even believed they were Charlie Ross and sought confirmation. None proved to be true. The ransom notes became a key piece of evidence. Their handwriting, tone, and spelling were studied and compared across decades. They were kept locked away, examined with new techniques as forensic science evolved. But no additional suspects ever surfaced. The notes remained the only trace of contact the kidnappers ever initiated. The disappearance of Charlie Ross changed American law enforcement. Before this case, there was no established method for handling kidnappings. The Ross case set precedents. Ransom negotiations, newspaper involvement, public alerts, and nationwide searches. It influenced how authorities treated child abductions for generations. In Philadelphia, the story lingered like a shadow. Residents remembered the buggy, the fireworks promise, the frantic search, and the heartbreaking realization that the child might never return. Over time, Charlie's name became part of the city's history, a reminder of a crime that shook an entire nation. The Ross family lived the rest of their lives without closure. Christian Ross died, still searching for answers. Walter, who witnessed the kidnapping as a child, carried the memory into adulthood. Every anniversary of that day brought fresh grief. Households throughout America began warning children not to talk to strangers, using the story of Charlie Ross as a cautionary tale. The case also sparked countless sightings and theories. Some believed Charlie had been taken west, raised under a different name. Others thought he had died shortly after the kidnapping and been buried in a hidden location. A few insisted he had been seen alive years later, but never proven as the missing child. The lack of evidence kept the story alive, whispered in homes, printed in newspapers, and passed down over generations. Charlie Ross became the face of America's first widely publicized kidnapping. His disappearance marked a turning point, a realization that even in the most peaceful neighborhoods, danger could arrive quietly, disguised as kindness. Families across the country changed their habits, watched their children more closely, and learned the terrifying possibility that a child could be taken in an instant, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions. To this day, the fate of Charlie Ross remains unknown. The two men believed to be responsible died without revealing whether the child was alive, hidden, or long gone. All that remains are the letters, witness accounts, and the memory of a boy who climbed into a buggy on a warm July afternoon, unaware that he would become part of one of the most haunting mysteries in early American crime history. Next story, Backpacker Murders, Australia, 1989 to 1992. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the east coast of Australia attracted thousands of young travelers each year. Backpackers arrived from Europe, North America, and Asia, drawn by the sun, the beaches, and the promise of adventure. They slept in hostels, hitchhiked between cities, and shared stories around campfires. The roads connecting towns were long, winding, and often flanked by dense bushland, stretching for miles without a single house in sight. It was along these roads that the shadows moved unnoticed. The first body appeared in December 1990. A young woman, known for her bright smile and carefree nature, had set out from Sydney with her backpack, planning to explore the coast. Weeks later, her remains were found in a remote bush area. Authorities noted the violence, the dismemberment, and the meticulous way her life had been ended. It was horrifying, and it became the first sign of a pattern that would terrify the nation. Over the next 2 years, more bodies surfaced. Young travelers, each with plans and dreams, vanished on coastal routes. Some were last seen hitchhiking, relying on the kindness of strangers. Others were on foot, carrying only small packs, hoping to reach the next town. Their disappearances seemed random, but forensic evidence would eventually reveal a chilling truth. A single perpetrator, moving along the eastern seaboard, was preying on vulnerable backpackers, isolating them, and taking their lives. Police worked tirelessly to link the cases. Witnesses described seeing a large man in a van near the locations where the women had disappeared. Hair, fibers, and small traces of evidence eventually pointed to one individual, Ivan Milat, a man who lived in a quiet home in the Belanglo State Forest area. To neighbors and friends, he appeared ordinary, quiet, somewhat reclusive, a handyman who kept to himself. Yet beneath that mundane exterior lurked an organized, cold-blooded killer who had been operating for years without detection. Milat's home and property revealed horrifying details. Hidden compartments, evidence of travel, and items belonging to victims were discovered. His movements along rural roads, his ability to approach young travelers, and his meticulous planning all pointed to a methodical mind, one that thrived on control, fear, and secrecy. Each abduction was carefully executed, each victim left alone only long enough for their disappearance to seem accidental. By the time Milat was arrested in 1994, the scale of his crimes had shocked the nation. 7 confirmed victims, and the possibility of many more who had disappeared without trace. During the trial, the courtroom was tense and hushed. Families of victims attended, their grief palpable, yet overshadowed by the methodical recounting of Milat's actions. Prosecutors detailed each attack, each abduction, each brutal encounter. Witnesses described last sightings. Forensic experts explained fiber evidence, and the police painstakingly reconstructed Milat's movements along the bush tracks that had claimed so many lives. The magnitude of the crimes, combined with the deliberate cruelty, left the nation stunned. Milat was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder. He received consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Authorities credited careful detective work, witness testimony, and advances in forensic science for finally bringing the case to a close. Yet the forest where the crimes took place retained a lingering darkness. Travelers, even years later, remained wary of hitchhiking alone. The legend of the backpacker murders became a cautionary tale whispered among those who ventured along Australia's isolated roads. Even decades later, Belanglo State Forest is marked by a quiet unease. The trees, which had once concealed Milat's crimes, stand as silent witnesses to the horrors that unfolded beneath their branches. Visitors can still sense the weight of the past in the still air and the rustling leaves. Next story, Newgate Calendar Criminals, England, 18th to 19th century. London in the 1700s was a city of contrasts. Narrow alleys reeked of refuse. Merchants' carts rattled over cobblestones, and the River Thames carried both commerce and filth. Amid the chaos of daily life, crime thrived, and the courts of England became a theater for the public's fascination with punishment, scandal, and daring escapes. Out of this environment emerged the Newgate Calendar, a collection of criminal biographies that chronicled the lives, trials, and executions of notorious offenders. The Newgate Calendar wasn't just a record, it was entertainment. Printed cheaply, sold in pamphlets, and sometimes read aloud in coffee houses, it gave ordinary people access to the dark stories of thieves, murderers, fraudsters, and escape artists. Over time, it became a cultural phenomenon, shaping how Londoners, and eventually the English-speaking world, thought about crime, justice, and morality. Some stories in the Newgate Calendar involved bold highwaymen, such as Dick Turpin, who rode the roads in the dead of night, robbing coaches with a swagger that captivated imaginations. His life, though criminal, was romanticized. Stories of daring escapes, clever disguises, and galloping through moonlit lanes were repeated again and again, feeding the public's appetite for excitement. Other entries detailed domestic criminals, poisoners like Mary Blandy, who killed her father with arsenic, or women who engaged in baby farming, leaving infants to die in neglect or deliberate harm. These cases horrified readers and sold countless pamphlets. The Newgate Calendar often described the meticulous planning of murders, the greed that motivated thefts, and the cunning required to evade capture. Each story carried a combination of shock, fascination, and practical warning. The structure of the Newgate Calendar followed a consistent pattern. It often began with the criminal's background, humble beginnings, early brushes with minor offenses, and the circumstances that led them into more serious crime. Then came the account of their offenses, the thefts, murders, or scams that made them infamous. Finally, the trial and execution were described in vivid detail, sometimes including the last words of the condemned. These accounts were rich in detail, designed to draw the reader into the criminal's world. One of the most infamous entries involved Jack Shepherd, the burglar and escape artist. His repeated prison breaks and audacious thefts captured the imagination of Londoners. Though Shepherd's story is famous on its own, the Newgate calendar cemented his place in popular culture. Every escape, every clever maneuver, was recorded with breathless narrative, emphasizing his cunning and the helplessness of the authorities. Highwaymen also featured heavily. Men like Claude Duval, who combined charm with ruthlessness, became legends in the Newgate calendar. Duval's highway robberies, his gallant manners toward victims, and his daring chases became archetypes of criminal heroism, despite the very real suffering he caused. The stories balanced terror and fascination, giving readers both horror and thrill. Murderers and poisoners provided the other side of the spectrum. Mary and Cotton, who poisoned husbands and children for insurance payouts, was chronicled with meticulous attention to detail. Each victim's death, each moment of calculation, became a page-turning account for readers who could not imagine committing such acts but were irresistibly drawn to the narrative. Fraudsters and con artists were included too. Schemes involving counterfeit money, elaborate swindles, and theatrical deceptions demonstrated that not all crime relied on violence. Cleverness and audacity could be just as effective. The Newgate calendar described the planning, execution, and eventual capture of these criminals, emphasizing the tension between ingenuity and the law. The publication also documented executions at Newgate Prison, which became public spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch hanging ceremonies, often in the thousands. The Newgate calendar would describe the condemned's last moments, sometimes noting confessions, sometimes quoting their final speeches. These passages were both macabre and gripping, giving readers a sense of closure while reinforcing the consequences of crime. Over time, the Newgate calendar grew into a vast anthology. Some editions contained hundreds of entries, covering decades of criminal activity. Readers could move from a story of a single petty thief to the saga of a notorious murderess, and then to the exploits of a celebrated highwayman, all in the span of a few pages. The narrative style, blending fact with dramatic flair, made each story compelling without needing embellishment beyond what had already occurred. The influence of the Newgate calendar extended beyond England. It inspired literature, theater, and even the emerging detective genre. Authors such as Charles Dickens referenced it, drawing on its accounts to shape characters and plots. The story's mix of moral lesson, suspense, and detailed description proved fertile ground for writers and dramatists seeking realism and excitement. One recurring feature of the calendar was its attention to cause and consequence. Each criminal's choices were meticulously documented, from their initial temptation to their capture and punishment. The combination of ordinary backgrounds with extraordinary deeds made readers wonder how seemingly average people could commit such acts. In this way, the Newgate calendar blurred the line between biography and sensational entertainment. The calendar also served as an early form of true crime journalism, offering insight into social conditions, law enforcement practices, and public reactions. Readers learned about the methods used by thieves, the organization of criminal gangs, and the evolving techniques of detection. In some cases, the Newgate calendar included warnings about particular dangers, such as the rise of poisoners or the prevalence of highway robbery, adding a quasi-educational layer to the entertainment. Notable examples from the calendar include the repeated arrests and escapes of Jonathan Wild, the so-called thief-taker general, whose manipulation of London's underworld rivaled his public reputation for law enforcement. The meticulous planning of Francois Prelati, who used trickery and alchemy to manipulate both nobility and criminals. And a host of petty thieves whose cleverness or audacity earned them lasting recognition. The stories varied in tone. Some were grim and horrifying, detailing murders, hangings, or the slow deaths caused by poisoning or neglect. Others were thrilling, recounting clever robberies, narrow escapes, and the audacity of criminals who seemed to operate without fear. Together, they formed a panorama of crime, law, and society over decades of England's urban and rural life. Crucially, the Newgate calendar did not shy away from humans at their most desperate. Poverty, hunger, and social inequality frequently appeared as background to criminal acts. Some stories hinted that circumstances drove individuals toward crime, while others portrayed pure greed or malice. The diversity of motives and methods made the collection endlessly absorbing. Public response to the calendar was intense. Street sellers reported brisk sales. Families read aloud to one another. Children sometimes heard the stories from adults and whispered the names of infamous thieves and murderers. Theater adaptations brought the tales to life, dramatizing the excitement, horror, and ingenuity contained in the pages. Over time, the Newgate calendar became part of the cultural fabric, shaping the English-speaking world's fascination with crime as both entertainment and cautionary tale. By the 19th century, the Newgate calendar had solidified its role as a true crime compendium, a record of criminal ingenuity and human folly. Its stories were not merely about punishment. They were about the strategies, psychology, and social environment that allowed crime to thrive. It documented a period when the law was evolving, public curiosity was voracious, and criminals became immortalized through words on paper. Next story. Infanticide and baby farming cases. Europe, 18th to 19th century. In cities and towns across Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, the birth of a child could be both a blessing and a burden. Poverty was widespread, social support for mothers almost non-existent, and unwed women faced scorn, shame, or outright danger. For some, desperate solutions emerged in the form of baby farming, a grim practice where infants were taken in by strangers or institutions, sometimes for a fee, and promised care that was far from guaranteed. The term baby farming covers a spectrum of practices. Some caregivers genuinely tried to care for children in difficult circumstances, but many exploited the vulnerability of parents, especially single mothers, to profit from their misfortune. Payments were collected up front, sometimes as a lump sum, sometimes as a weekly allowance. Once the money was secured, the fate of the child often depended on the integrity, or lack thereof, of the caretaker. One of the earliest and most infamous cases emerged in England during the mid-19th century. Mrs. Marion Cotton, although later known for poisoning adult relatives, exemplified the blurred lines of parental and caretaker crimes. Women like Cotton and others who ran baby farming operations often took in infants under the guise of care, but neglected, starved, or even killed them. In some documented cases, arsenic or other poisons were administered to children who became ill or demanded resources, making natural causes a convenient cover. London, Liverpool, and Manchester were hotspots. Crowded slums, overpopulated workhouses, and impoverished neighborhoods created the perfect conditions for baby farming to flourish. Women desperate to hide illegitimate births were particularly vulnerable. They might pay a weekly stipend, expecting their child to be raised safely. Instead, many infants were left to die of neglect or deliberate murder, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. Investigations were difficult. Infant deaths were common, and record-keeping was poor. Distinguishing between neglect, disease, and intentional harm required careful observation, rarely available at the time. Yet some caregivers were careless enough to leave patterns. Too many infants dying under the same roof, suspicious burials, or blatant accounts of mistreatment alerted authorities. Coroner's inquests would reveal the horrifying truth. Some women had been deliberately killing children for financial gain. One notorious example is Genevieve Lermite in Belgium in the late 19th century. Lermite, entrusted with the care of infants, systematically neglected and murdered them. The investigation revealed a trail of abandoned and poisoned children, unmasking a business built on deception and murder. Her trial drew attention not only for the gruesome details, but also for the societal failures that allowed such crimes to occur. Across Europe, similar cases followed. In France, Germany, and the Netherlands, baby farming scandals emerged in newspapers, in pamphlets, and in court records. The stories were chilling. Infants left in dark rooms without food or water, left exposed to harsh conditions, or killed when payment stopped. Parents, often desperate and ashamed, sometimes had no recourse, trusting their children to people who saw them as commodities rather than lives. The public reaction was intense. Outrage led to reforms, stricter licensing for caregivers, and improved monitoring of institutions. Yet even with these measures, the human toll remained high. Many parents lost children. Some infants survived only by luck, and a shadow of neglect and exploitation lingered over urban centers for decades. The horror of baby farming cases is not simply the act of murder, but the combination of opportunity, vulnerability, and greed. Each child represented both life and livelihood. The act of killing was methodical, calculated, and often rationalized by the perpetrators as a necessary business decision. Investigators, in turn, struggled against incomplete evidence, societal taboos, and the difficulty of proving intent in the deaths of the most defenseless victims imaginable. The historical records show a disturbing spectrum. Some caregivers were cruel opportunists, others were calculated killers. Some infants perished quietly, unrecorded, while others became part of sensational trials that gripped the public. Pamphlets detailed every grim detail, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes chillingly accurate, feeding both moral panic and the emerging fascination with true crime. Baby farming cases also reveal the intersection of gender, poverty, and law. Many perpetrators were women, often exploiting the system that relied on their labor and discretion. They were both products of a society that limited opportunities for women and agents of cruelty that preyed on those even more vulnerable than themselves. The consequences were real and lasting. Laws began to evolve, emphasizing registration of births, monitoring of caregivers, and criminal penalties for neglect and murder. Courts became more sophisticated in interpreting evidence of repeated child deaths in the same household. Yet for every reform, the stories of lost infants remained a grim reminder of human capacity for both indifference and calculated harm. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, these cases left an indelible mark on European society. They shaped public perceptions of child welfare, parental trust, and the responsibilities of those entrusted with care. They also became staples of sensational press coverage and, later, historical study, a record of a time when survival, greed, and desperation collided with tragic consequences. The legacy of these cases is not just legal or social. It is also cultural. Tales of baby farming inspired literature, plays, and later true crime works, embedding themselves in collective memory. Readers could encounter stories of cruel caregivers, desperate parents, and innocent victims in newspapers, pamphlets, and books, each narrative emphasizing both horror and fascination. In a Europe that was industrializing, urbanizing, and changing rapidly, baby farming cases highlighted the dark undercurrents of society. Next story, The Servant Girl Annihilator, Austin, Texas, 1884 to 1885. Our story now goes to the humid, lantern-lit nights of 1880s Austin. A town on the rise, its streets growing busier, its music drifting from saloons long after midnight. But beneath the laughter and clatter of hooves, a different sound lurked. The quiet echo of footsteps behind shuttered windows, the whisper of someone moving where no one should be. What followed would become one of the earliest recorded serial killer cases in American history, a mystery that terrified a growing city and left investigators chasing shadows. Austin in the early 1880s was supposed to be a promise, a young capital swelling with opportunity, its population pushing past 10,000. Street lamps were still rare, and entire neighborhoods relied on moonlight as their only protection. In the quieter districts, servants lived in small outbuildings behind their employers' homes, sleeping in modest rooms that were meant to offer privacy, but instead became perfect targets. The first attack came in the spring of 1884. A young woman named Molly Smith, a servant in a respectable household, was found brutally murdered behind her residence. The horror of the scene stunned the small police force. It wasn't simply the violence. It was the precision, the unmistakable intent behind it. But a single crime, however terrible, could still be rationalized as an outlier. Then came another attack, and another, and another. Each victim was a young servant girl, often dragged from her room in the dead of night. Houses showed signs of forced entry, but carefully done, quietly executed. Witnesses reported seeing dark, fast-moving figures slipping between workers' quarters and alleyways. Others swore they heard strange tapping on windows, only to find no one there when they checked. By late 1884, the newspapers had given the killer a name: the Servant Girl Annihilator. Austin residents refused to walk alone after sunset. Families barred doors with furniture. Men took turns staying awake through the night, armed with lanterns and rifles. But the killer didn't stop. In 1885, the attacks escalated. Two women, Gracie Vance and Orange Washington, were murdered on the same night in separate parts of the city. Rumors swept through Texas like wildfire. Some believed the killer was a trained butcher. Others thought he was a drifter, someone able to blend in and vanish without suspicion. More ominous theories suggested someone local, a man with enough knowledge to navigate the city's darkest corners without a sound. The Austin police, already overwhelmed, attempted mass sweeps. Dozens of suspects were detained, questioned, released. Detectives from other cities were called in. Bloodhounds were brought to scenes, lanterns illuminating footprints in the dust. But each lead evaporated, as if the killer moved in a world just outside the reach of law and logic. The city's fear peaked on Christmas Eve, 1885. Two prominent women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, were murdered in separate attacks within hours of each other. The brutality shocked even hardened frontier officers. This time, the killer had struck not at servants, but at women from respected families, as if daring the city to stop him. The pressure on authorities became unbearable. A few suspects were arrested, some even convicted on questionable evidence, but historians widely agree that none of them matched the pattern or capability of the killer. Austin knew it and felt it. Many residents believed the murderer had slipped away into the night, moving eastward. Some would later wonder whether he resurfaced in another city across the ocean around 3 years later. A thought whispered more than spoken. By early 1886, the killings in Austin abruptly ceased. No one was ever definitively linked to the crimes. No confession, no deathbed admission, no journal, no proof. Just silence. But those who lived in Austin at the time remembered. They spoke of nights when the city felt watched, when footsteps echoed behind them on empty dirt roads, when lamps flickered for no reason and dogs refused to leave their porches. They remembered shuttering windows, checking locks twice, then 3 times. They remembered the fear of lying awake, listening, waiting. More than a century later, the case remains open in spirit. One of America's earliest serial murder mysteries, its shadow stretching far beyond the dim streets of 1880s Texas. And if you walk Austin's old neighborhoods today, where modern houses stand on the footprints of those long-gone servant quarters, locals still sometimes speak of strange movements at night, soft steps, muffled sounds, or the faint impression that someone is lingering just beyond the edge of the streetlight. A presence that never truly yelled. Next story, Hillside Strangler Murders, USA, 1977 to 1978. Los Angeles in the late 1970s was a sprawling, restless city. Freeways cut through neighborhoods, the night air thick with smog and the distant hum of traffic. It was easy for someone to vanish without a trace in the maze of streets, alleys, and apartment complexes. Among the ordinary rhythms of life, a pair of men moved with chilling purpose, leaving a trail of fear that would grip the city for over a year. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bono Jr., cousins by blood, had grown up in families that fostered different forms of dysfunction and control. They eventually bonded over a shared fascination with power, control, and a macabre sense of entitlement. Their lives converged in Los Angeles in the mid-1970s, where they began a sequence of abductions and murders that would terrify the city. The first known victim was discovered on a quiet hillside in late 1977. Young women, often working in or around the city, disappeared without immediate notice. When their bodies were found, they were posed and bound in ways that suggested planning and ritualistic control. The killer, or killers, demonstrated a disturbing pattern: careful restraint, strangulation, and a morbid attention to the display of the bodies. The city reacted with confusion and fear. Los Angeles Police Department officers struggled to connect the dots between the seemingly random victims. Yet forensic evidence and witness accounts gradually revealed links, shared characteristics among the victims, similar methods of abduction, and the eerie consistency of their final locations. The moniker Hillside Strangler emerged, a name born from the locations where bodies were discovered and the terror they invoked. Next up is the green bicycle case. England in 1919 wore a kind of bruised stillness. The war had ended, but the countryside hadn't quite remembered how to breathe again. Villages lay quiet, their streets edged with hedgerows and old stone walls that seemed to hold in silence. People spoke in low voices, politely, cautiously, as though any loud noise might crack the fragile peace holding everything together. Leicestershire was no different. Its rolling fields and narrow lanes still carried the echo of marching boots and distant gunfire, memories stamped into the soil. And on one of those lanes, Red Lodge Road, something happened that the locals would speak about for decades, though never loudly and never comfortably. Bella Wright was 21, hard-working, sensible, the sort of girl who made no trouble and drew no gossip. She rode her bicycle often, a black one with worn pedals and a familiar rattle in its chain. People recognized her by the way she leaned forward slightly as she pedaled, determined and deliberate, as though always on her way towards something important. On the evening it happened, the sky was the color of wet slate. Low, heavy clouds drifted over the fields. A mist clung to the grass, and the air tasted faintly of rain. Bella rode out anyway. She had an errand to run for her uncle, and weather didn't tend to stop her. She wasn't alone on the road that night. Several witnesses saw her speaking with a man on a green bicycle, a peculiar, bright shade that stood out sharply against the dull countryside. He looked ordinary enough, clean-cut, respectable, a man you might nod hello to without worry, a man you wouldn't remember if you had to describe him later, but you would remember the bicycle. The two were seen riding in the same direction, Bella leading, the man trailing a little behind. Nothing about it seemed strange at the time. Nothing seemed urgent. Nothing at all hinted that the evening would end any differently than it began, until Bella never made it home. Later that night, a farmer walking along Red Lodge Road found her lying in the grass beside her fallen bicycle. Her body was unnaturally still, her face turned slightly toward the darkened hedgerow, as though she'd heard something just before she fell. At first, people assumed it was an accident. Roads were uneven, the light was fading, and bicycles could be unpredictable. But a closer look told another story. A single gunshot wound, small and precise, marred her face. The kind of shot someone would have to aim carefully for. The kind someone fired deliberately. Villagers whispered. The police questioned everyone. But the only detail anyone felt certain about was the stranger with the green bicycle. And when officers finally located the man, months later, after a hunt that stretched across counties, he swore he had nothing to do with it. He insisted he'd spoken with Bella. Yes, but only briefly. He said he'd ridden away long before anything happened. He said the bicycle meant nothing. And yet, the frame of that same green bicycle would be dredged from a canal, disassembled, hidden, thrown away like a guilty thought. But guilt is heavier than metal. It sinks slower. It resurfaces faster. The village of Little Stretton never fully forgot the sight of that bright green machine on their quiet road. And even now, more than a century later, the case remains unsettled. One of those stories where truth feels close enough to touch, but somehow always slips between your fingers. Like a man on a bicycle disappearing around a bend in the road just before night falls. Now, on to the next story. In December 1956, the city of Chicago, Illinois, was gripped by winter's early chill. Snow had begun to accumulate along the streets, and residents navigated the familiar rhythms of a city bustling with commerce, school, and community life. Yet amid this ordinary backdrop, a disappearance occurred that would haunt the city for decades. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, aged 15 and 13, left their home one evening to attend a local concert and never returned. The sisters were known for their close bond, shared interests, and participation in school and neighborhood activities. Barbara, the elder, was thoughtful and protective, while Patricia possessed a bright curiosity and eagerness to explore. Their mother, a widow, had relied on the girls' maturity and independence, trusting them to follow routines responsibly. On the evening of December 28, 1956, they departed their home with friends to attend the concert, expecting to return safely by nightfall. When the girls failed to return, concern quickly escalated. Their mother contacted local authorities, prompting an immediate response from the Chicago Police Department. Officers canvassed the area, questioned neighbors, and retraced the sisters' steps along their anticipated route. Initial searches revealed no trace of the girls, intensifying fear and confusion within both the family and the surrounding community. As the investigation unfolded, authorities explored multiple avenues. One early theory suggested that the girls had run away, though their close ties to family and school made this unlikely. Another considered the possibility of abduction by an individual familiar with the neighborhood, capable of exploiting routine patterns to isolate the victims. The lack of witnesses and physical evidence complicated efforts to identify suspects or reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the girls' disappearance. Days later, the bodies of Barbara and Patricia were discovered in a remote area north of the city. They had been strangled, and signs of physical restraint suggested that the perpetrator had acted with premeditation. The brutality of the crime shocked the community, highlighting the vulnerability of even the most ordinary routines. Law enforcement faced an urgent need to identify the individual responsible while contending with the limitations of investigative methods in the 1950s, which lacked many modern forensic tools. Investigators questioned hundreds of potential witnesses, including friends, family, and acquaintances of the sisters. They examined known criminals in the area, cross-referenced recent arrests, and followed leads that ranged from seemingly credible to purely speculative. Despite exhaustive efforts, no suspect could be definitively linked to the crime, and the case gradually became a persistent enigma, emblematic of the challenges inherent in mid-20th century homicide investigations. The circumstances surrounding the murders fueled widespread speculation. Some theorists suggested that the sisters had inadvertently encountered someone with violent intentions while walking home. Others proposed that a predatory individual had been observing the family, learning their routines, and striking at an opportune moment. The combination of randomness and apparent planning created a tension between understanding motive and accepting the possibility of an incomprehensible act. Media coverage amplified the case's impact, portraying the tragedy in stark and human terms. Newspapers detailed the sisters' lives, the search efforts, and the ongoing investigation. Photographs of the girls appeared in both local and national publications, fostering public engagement and concern. Community members organized searches, while ordinary citizens expressed a heightened awareness of potential dangers in urban environments, particularly for children and teenagers navigating streets independently. The Grimes sisters case illustrates broader themes in criminal investigation. It highlights the vulnerability of routine, the challenge of identifying perpetrators in densely populated areas, and the limitations of investigative technology at the time. Fingerprinting, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence were relied upon heavily. Yet without modern DNA analysis or forensic profiling, investigators struggled to narrow potential suspects. The case remains a cautionary example of how ordinary life can intersect with extraordinary violence, leaving enduring questions about opportunity, motive, and human behavior. Over the years, various theories have persisted. Some suggest that the perpetrator may have been a transient individual with knowledge of the area. Others consider the possibility of a neighbor or acquaintance exploiting familiarity to commit the crime. Each hypothesis reflects an effort to reconcile the randomness of the act with the meticulousness apparent in the method of murder. The inability to confirm any single theory adds to the case's enduring intrigue and unease. For the families and the community, the murder of Barbara and Patricia Grimes represented a profound loss and a lingering challenge. The sisters were more than victims. They were individuals whose lives reflected ordinary joys, relationships, and routines. Their sudden and violent deaths created a void that extended beyond the immediate family, affecting friends, neighbors, and the broader city. The emotional impact, coupled with the unresolved nature of the crime, underscores the long-term consequences of violent acts on communities and collective memory. In reflecting on the Grimes sisters' case, one can imagine the streets of Chicago on that winter evening, quiet neighborhoods illuminated by streetlights, and the girls walking together with youthful confidence. The ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted in a moment of inexplicable violence, leaving behind a legacy of grief, unanswered questions, and investigative challenge. It is a story defined by absence, by the limits of understanding, and by the human desire for resolution in the face of incomprehensible acts. Modern investigators and true crime historians continue to examine the case. Archival records, witness statements, and crime scene reports are reviewed in light of contemporary analytical methods. While new forensic technologies have advanced significantly, the passage of time, loss of witnesses, and gaps in initial documentation present obstacles that have yet to be overcome. The enduring status of a case as unsolved keeps public interest alive, emphasizing both the historical and psychological dimensions of violent crime. The Grimes sisters' murders are remembered not only for the crime itself, but for their broader implications. They illustrate how everyday routines can expose vulnerability, how investigative limitations affect outcomes, and how communities respond to tragedy. The case highlights the importance of vigilance, awareness, and systematic investigation, while acknowledging that even thorough efforts may not always yield closure. Ultimately, the murder of Barbara and Patricia Grimes remains unsolved, a quiet and persistent mystery. For investigators, historians, and the public, it represents both the challenge of comprehending violent acts and the enduring human need for understanding. The sisters' lives, abruptly and violently ended, continue to resonate through memory, reflection, and the ongoing search for answers. Now, on to the next story. On the evening of May 25, 1996, the campus of California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo carried the usual energy of college life. Students moved between dormitories, social events unfolded across campus, and the rhythms of young adulthood continued in their familiar patterns. Among those present was Kristen Smart, a 19-year-old freshman with a quiet, unassuming presence and a reputation for kindness and friendliness. What began as a typical weekend evening would become the start of a long and unresolved mystery that continues to resonate with both her family and the broader public. Kristen was attending a party off campus that evening, a common social activity for students at Cal Poly. She was accompanied by friends and acquaintances, navigating the ordinary dynamics of social life in a college town. As the night progressed, Kristen became separated from the group, choosing to walk back to her dormitory alone. Her disappearance was not immediately noticed, as friends assumed she had either returned independently or found other company along the way. The combination of college autonomy and the campus's modest size created conditions in which a student's absence could go unnoticed for hours, even in an environment where many people were present. By the following morning, Kristen had not returned to her dorm room. Concern grew among friends and roommates, prompting contact with her family. When authorities were notified, the initial search focused on the campus, surrounding neighborhoods and nearby roadways. Investigators questioned attendees of the party, monitored phone records, and canvassed local streets. Yet the first critical hours yielded few substantive leads. The absence of witnesses who could account for her final movements immediately complicated efforts to determine her whereabouts. Over time, investigators identified a man of interest, Paul Flores, who had been acquainted with Kristen at the time. Flores's behavior on the night of her disappearance, as well as inconsistencies in his statements to authorities, drew scrutiny. Law enforcement focused on interviews, background checks, and behavioral analysis to determine the potential involvement of individuals in her disappearance. However, the case faced significant challenges due to the passage of time, the lack of direct evidence, and the limited availability of reliable witnesses able to reconstruct the sequence of events accurately. Authorities employed a range of investigative strategies, including searches of remote areas, monitoring of local properties, and appeals to the public for information. Flyers, media campaigns, and public announcements were utilized to generate leads. Despite these efforts, the case remained unresolved for many years. The uncertainty surrounding Kristen's fate created profound distress for her family, who maintained a continuous and patient effort to uncover information, emphasizing both their love for her and the emotional weight of ambiguity. The case of Kristen Smart reflects broader challenges in missing persons investigations, particularly when incidents occur in environments where social activity, mobility, and personal autonomy intersect. College campuses, with their combination of large populations, transient residents, and unsupervised areas, present unique obstacles for authorities. The absence of immediate evidence, coupled with the passage of time, can significantly hinder the ability to establish both a timeline and the identity of potential perpetrators. Over the years, new evidence and investigative techniques gradually emerged. Forensic analysis, witness testimony, and advances in investigative technology allowed authorities to revisit the case with fresh perspectives. Cold case investigators periodically examined old records, interviewed new witnesses, and explored connections that may have been overlooked. These efforts reflect the persistence required in long-term investigations and the commitment to justice that drives families and law enforcement alike. The story also highlights the interplay between individual behavior and environmental context. Kristen's decision to walk alone, the dynamics of social gatherings, and the choices made by those around her contributed to a sequence of events that, while ordinary in isolation, ultimately resulted in a prolonged mystery. Analysts have considered both the psychological and situational factors that influence human decision-making, emphasizing the ways in which small choices can have profound and unforeseeable consequences. Public engagement has played a significant role in maintaining attention on Kristen Smart's disappearance. Media coverage, online advocacy, and community involvement have kept the case in the public eye, ensuring that leads and information are continuously sought. This attention underscores the broader societal investment in resolving cases of missing persons, reflecting a collective desire to understand, remember, and seek justice for individuals whose stories might otherwise be lost. In recent developments, legal proceedings have brought renewed focus to the case. Charges against Paul Flores were eventually pursued, based on accumulated evidence and testimony collected over years of investigation. While the legal process provided a measure of accountability, the extended timeline highlights the challenges inherent in resolving cases with delayed evidence and prolonged uncertainty. The combination of legal, forensic, and social factors illustrates the complexity of addressing disappearances that occur in seemingly ordinary circumstances. Reflecting on Kristen Smart's disappearance, one can imagine the campus of Cal Poly in the spring of 1996. The dormitories, quiet streets, and open spaces, and the ordinary decisions that led to a tragic and unresolved event. The contrast between the routine environment and the extraordinary nature of the disappearance heightens the poignancy of the case. It is a reminder of both the vulnerability of individuals and the importance of sustained investigative effort in the face of incomplete information. Ultimately, the story of Kristen Smart is defined by uncertainty, persistence, and the search for resolution. It underscores the interplay of ordinary life, human behavior, and investigative challenge, demonstrating how even familiar environments can become the setting for enduring mysteries. Now, on to the next story. On the afternoon of November 28, 1969, 22-year-old Betsy Aardsma entered the Petit Library at Pennsylvania State University, a historic brick building that had long served as a hub for research and study. Betsy was a graduate student in English literature, known among friends and colleagues as intelligent, thoughtful, and quietly independent. She carried herself with an understated grace, her calm demeanor and keen intellect, making her presence felt without drawing attention. She had a love for books, poetry, and long hours spent examining texts, often losing herself in the quiet of libraries. That Friday, dressed in a red skirt and a blue sweater, Betsy had come to review materials for her graduate research, intending to spend the afternoon immersed in study. She entered the library as she often did, greeted by the familiar hush of pages turning and the distant echo of footsteps on the tiled floors. Shortly after Betsy entered, she was seen by a few passing students walking through the library's hallways and heading toward a sparsely populated area on the second floor. There, near the stairwell, her life would be violently interrupted. A library employee soon discovered her collapsed on the floor, the victim of a single fatal stab wound to the back. The attack had been sudden and deliberate, executed with a precision that left little time for her to react or defend herself. Emergency personnel were called immediately, but Betsy was pronounced dead at the scene. The news of her murder rippled quickly through the university and the surrounding community, creating shock and fear among students and faculty who had long considered the campus a safe environment. It was the type of violent, senseless crime that unsettled everyone, the sort that made people reconsider the safety of familiar spaces. Investigators arrived swiftly, combing the library for evidence and interviewing those who had been present. Yet despite the building being populated by students and staff, very few had seen anything suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbance in the stacks, and Betsy's belongings, including her purse and other personal items, were untouched. From the outset, robbery was ruled out as a motive. Authorities quickly began to consider that the murder was targeted, but the question of who might have committed such a crime and why was bewildering. The attack had been carried out with efficiency and intent, a lone stab to the back that immediately incapacitated her, and yet there were no witnesses or immediate clues pointing toward a perpetrator. Over the following days, law enforcement pursued a broad range of leads. They examined students, faculty, and staff, trying to identify anyone who might have had a reason to harm Betsy or who had been observed acting suspiciously in the library on that afternoon. Behavioral analysts and detectives considered the possibility of a random act by a disturbed individual, someone with violent impulses who saw an opportunity in a quiet library environment. Others suggested it might have been a personal attack, someone who knew Betsy or harbored resentment. The challenge for investigators was the absence of physical evidence. Fingerprints were minimal, no weapon was recovered, and there were no clear signs of struggle beyond the fatal stab wound. The mystery deepened with each passing day, as no suspect emerged and no motive could be established. The circumstances of Betsy's murder were perplexing in part because of its location. The library was a public space, filled with books, tables, and students. Yet the area where she was attacked was secluded enough to allow a perpetrator to strike without immediate detection. Investigators speculated about the timing of the attack, the choice of weapon, and the deliberate nature of the act. The single stab wound suggested both intent and control, implying that the assailant had either prior knowledge of the space or the confidence to act spontaneously in a public setting. The lack of additional injuries reinforced the notion that the murder was focused and intentional rather than the result of a struggle or escalation. In the years that followed, the case remained a cold one, despite periodic efforts by law enforcement and private investigators to uncover new evidence. Advances in forensic science, including DNA analysis, offered hope, but the initial limitations in evidence collection in 1969 meant there was little physical material available for testing. Over time, the library itself became a site of eerie fascination, the place where a brilliant young woman's life had been abruptly ended. Students and faculty would sometimes recount the story, a chilling reminder of vulnerability in spaces considered safe and the tragedy of a life interrupted before it could fully unfold. Friends and family described Betsy as a dedicated student and a gentle presence, someone who was quiet but deeply engaged with the world around her. She had recently completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Michigan and had relocated to Pennsylvania to pursue her graduate degree, immersing herself in literature and research. Her parents and siblings were devastated by her sudden death, struggling with the knowledge that she had been taken in a place that should have been secure. The community mourned her loss and was shaken by the realization that violence could erupt in the most ordinary of circumstances, in the midst of routine study or intellectual pursuit. The mystery surrounding Betsy's murder has persisted for over 5 decades. Numerous theories have been proposed by investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. Some suggest that the assailant may have been a student or visitor who knew the library's layout intimately, allowing them to strike and escape unnoticed. Others have speculated about possible connections to individuals familiar with Betsy personally, though no concrete evidence has ever substantiated such claims. The randomness of the crime, combined with the absence of reliable witnesses, has made it one of the most confounding unsolved cases in Pennsylvania history. Despite the lack of resolution, Betsy's story has continued to resonate. True crime researchers and cold case teams have revisited her murder, hoping that modern forensic techniques could yield answers from any preserved evidence, whether from fingerprints, clothing, or other objects recovered at the scene. The case has also served as a cautionary tale about the importance of safety in public spaces, reminding communities that even areas of learning and research can become the setting for violent acts. Betsy's memory has been honored by those who knew her and by generations of students who have learned of her story, ensuring that her life, though cut short, is not forgotten. Now, on to the next story. It was the evening of February 16, 1974, Valentine's weekend in Fort Worth, Texas. 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker, a high school cheerleader, was at the Western Hills High School Valentine's dance with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, the school's star football player. They were the picture of small-town youth, popular, outgoing, and seemingly invincible. After the dance, the two stopped at a nearby bowling alley to grab a bite to eat before heading home. It was supposed to be a carefree night, one of those memories that linger long after graduation. Instead, it became the night that shattered an entire community. Sometime around midnight, Rodney pulled into the parking lot of the bowling alley. They stayed in the car for a while, talking and enjoying the quiet after the dance. Then, without warning, a man approached the passenger side door. Before Rodney could react, the man yanked the door open and struck him in the head several times with what was later believed to be the butt of a pistol. Stunned and bleeding, Rodney tried to fight back, but the attacker was too strong. Carla screamed as the man grabbed her, dragging her out of the car and into the darkness. Rodney regained consciousness minutes later, dazed and covered in blood. The passenger door hung open. Carla's purse was left behind, and she was gone. He stumbled into the bowling alley and begged for help, shouting that someone had taken his girlfriend. Police were called immediately, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of Carla or her abductor. The only evidence was a trail of blood, a broken purse strap, and Rodney's injuries, a chilling confirmation that the attack had been deliberate and violent. In the following days, hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement in a desperate search for the missing teenager. Helicopters scoured the surrounding fields and woods, while police dogs traced faint scents that led nowhere. Carla's family, especially her parents, Leighton and Doris Walker, pleaded publicly for her safe return. The Fort Worth community, shaken by the brutality of the abduction, held on to hope that she might still be alive. 3 days later, that hope vanished. On February 20th, 1974, a man walking near Benbrook Lake, roughly 10 miles from where Carla had been taken, noticed something lying in a culvert near the road. It was Carla's body. She was still wearing the blue prom-style dress from the dance. An autopsy later revealed she had been beaten, drugged, and strangled. The medical examiner found evidence of sexual assault and a high level of Securil, a sedative, in her system, a drug that suggested her killer had medical or pharmacological knowledge. The discovery devastated the community and raised even more questions. Who could have done this and why? Police initially focused on Rodney McCoy, given that he had been the last person to see Carla alive. But his head injuries, consistent statements, and genuine distress convinced investigators that he was not the killer. Other early leads included local men with histories of violence, but none of them matched the evidence or witness accounts. The description Rodney provided, a white male, roughly 6 feet tall with brown hair and a medium build, could have matched half the city. Despite the violent nature of the crime, physical evidence was limited. DNA analysis was still years away, and the investigation relied largely on interviews and polygraphs. Detectives questioned dozens of suspects, including one man who had attempted to abduct another woman in a similar way, but no one could be definitively linked to the murder. As time passed, the case grew cold, joining the long list of unsolved Texas homicides from the 1970s. For decades, the Walker family refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Carla's brother, Jim Walker, continued to push police to revisit the evidence whenever forensic science advanced. Each new technology brought renewed hope, first with fingerprint databases, then with early DNA testing in the 1990s, and finally with genetic genealogy in the 2010s. But for years, those efforts yielded nothing. The evidence was too degraded, the databases too limited. Then in 2020, everything changed. That year, Fort Worth police submitted DNA samples from Carla's clothing to Othram Incorporated, a Texas-based forensic lab specializing in advanced genetic genealogy, the same kind of analysis that had identified the Golden State Killer just 2 years earlier. Using trace amounts of DNA, Othram's team built a genetic profile and began matching it against public genealogy databases. The result pointed to a man named Glenn Samuel McCurley. McCurley had lived in Fort Worth at the time of the murder, only a few miles from the Walkers' home. He was 77 years old when detectives knocked on his door in 2020. Back in 1974, McCurley had been questioned briefly because he owned a .22 Ruger pistol, the same caliber used in the abduction. But at the time, police couldn't connect him to the murder. When investigators asked in 1974 where his gun was, McCurley claimed it had been stolen, a statement they had no way to verify. Now, decades later, DNA did what witness testimony never could. Detectives collected a sample from McCurley's trash, and the results came back as a direct match to the semen found on Carla's clothing. It was definitive. Nearly half a century after the crime, police had identified Carla Walker's killer. McCurley was arrested in September 2020. During interviews, he initially denied any involvement, but the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Confronted with the scientific proof, he eventually confessed. He admitted that he had attacked Carla and Rodney that night, taken Carla away, and murdered her. He described events in a detached, emotionless manner, details that only the killer could have known. When asked why, he gave no clear answer. There was no motive beyond impulse, control, and cruelty. In August 2021, facing overwhelming evidence, Glenn McCurley pleaded guilty to capital murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He was 78 years old. For the Walker family, it marked the end of an agonizing 46-year wait for justice. Carla's brother Jim told reporters that while nothing could bring his sister back, at least now the truth was known, and the man who took her life would never hurt anyone again.